Christians versus Pharisees, choosing sides and how to fight for them in the Mormon Civil War. Episode 8. The DODO shoots his musket at the valedictorian.
I'm not an idiot. You know, I've read a couple of books and I've been to a pretty good school. And I have chosen to be in this church because of the faith that I feel and the inspiration that comes.
No, I'm not calling you a cult. I'm just saying that I've met people who used to be in the church.
I've met people. And if people want to call us a cult, they can call us a cult and you can call us a cult. But we are 14 million and growing. And I'd like to think that your respect for me would be enough to know that this man doesn't seem like a dodo.
Greetings, intrepid listeners. In 1965, plans were first published for a really complicated motorway interchange at Gravelly Hill near the city of Birmingham in the English Midlands. Birmingham Evening Mail journalist Roy Smith described the plans for the junction as, quote, like a cross between a plate of spaghetti and an unsuccessful attempt at a Staffordshire knot, close quote, with the headline above the article on the newspaper's front page reading, Spaghetti Junction. And so it was that the nickname Spaghetti Junction for this sometimes confusing to navigate intersection was born. At this moment in time, I fear navigating the threads in the Mormon Civil War podcast might be starting to feel like navigating Spaghetti Junction. It certainly is in my head. I have a few more episode 6 minisodes exploring the structure and details of the Pharisee-Mormon General Authorities' strategies of thought control and information suppression to finish and post. I have at least another minisode of episode 7 celebrating the wonderful strengths in Mormonism I think can still save the LDS Church and turn it into a credible world religion to get out there. When British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was asked what was the greatest challenge for a statesman, he replied, "Events, dear boy, events." Since my state president decided to put me on trial and excommunicate me for apostasy for what I am saying in this podcast, I have rather been overtaken by events. I have been interviewed by my fellow Brit Venger podcasters Nemo the Mormon and amazing Scottish duo Jane Christie and Alana Wilson-Bryce on their 21st Century Saints podcast about that experience. I have a presentation for Sunstone UK in a couple of weeks to get ready. I've been asked to create an episode summarising this podcast for Mormon Stories listeners to get out to them before John Dillon interviews me and my much more interesting wife Lynn, and as a high school teacher the new term kicks off this week. Who knew being a dissident Mormon would be even more time consuming than being a wholly kosher one? But what fun! I am not complaining. The bottom line is that my ward only had about 20 people attending this week, and even out of summer holiday season, we don't get many more than that. And this is the near future heading for most of the other LDS wards in the world in the next 10 to 20 years at current accelerating rates of decline. The Mormons of Birmingham Stake, where Spaghetti Junction is coincidentally, are in the biggest trouble of all in my country. They lost 40% of their active membership in the last 10 years. Imagine that happening to your stake. How about this as a thought experiment? What if you could go back in time, a decade or two, and make some radical changes to prevent that happening to your stake? Would you do it? What if those changes included ordaining women and sealing same-sex families in the temple? Would you back off and not bother, and just let all those people and their children and grandchildren go, never again to engage with the LDS Church and Mormonism? Is that a step too far for you? Or would you at least give it a try to work out ways for that to work doctrinally, and tell the people back then to suck it up and cope, because the alternative is that they and their children will nearly all leave the church and stop making Christ part of their life? What matters more, really? The kids are clear. They will not join or remain in a church that is racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or science and truth phobic. They are not going to tolerate a regime of relentless, intrusive, and unhealthy sexual shaming by their clergy and parents. Most of the 80% of our young people who leave the church by age 30 do so as soon as that gets going, in their young teenage years. This reality is an immovable object. It is not going to change, and the resistance to tolerating these bigotries and violations of scientific evidence that the LDS hardliners are clinging to and claiming they will never compromise on is only going to grow. We have been told for many years to expect this and regard it as a sign of the end times, the world's final descent into Babylon and depravity, when only the most faithful will stay loyal to what Mormon jargon calls these standards. This is why our hardliners are becoming harder and more uncompromising in their rhetoric, attacking and fearing society's increased levels of tolerance of human diversity. They have been carefully trained to find all this reassuring of their own certainties, rather than a reason to challenge and reconsider their certainties. And when you have convinced yourself, and your First Presidency and Young Men's Presidency keep telling you this literally is the end now, and our children are going to be a Lord's battalion to usher in the actual millennium, forgetting they told that to us, and our parents, and their parents, of course, you assume you're in such desperate times that desperate measures are justified, including letting most of your congregation and family members leave the church and always blaming them for being weak and the world for being wicked, for their loss of trust in the church and their departure, rather than ever wondering if maybe the problem is yourselves or the church and its leaders. In an unsettling and confusing and threatening state of panic, you lose your grip on reality and perspective and stop thinking and analysing and resort to your animal instincts of survival, fight or flight. You double down and get ready to fight the world, or you run away and refuse to even speak or listen to the people who left, in case they infect you with their apostasy virus. And if they speak up too loudly to try and tell you what's really going on anyway, you excommunicate them. In this episode 8A, I will be taking a deep dive into recent developments in how the church is handling one of those immovable objects that many current Latter-day Saints and most of our potential future generations are not going to budge on. That we need to make significant and urgent reforms to be much more intelligent, compassionate, and inclusive towards LGBTQ people, or lose most of our current and potential future membership. Apostle Jeffrey Holland has just unleashed a Jaredite shizstorm of alarm, disappointment, and controversy by telling the Brigham Young University faculty to stop being kind and thoughtful in response to their LGBTQ students, who often go through absolute hell trying to be faithful to their religion, while its leaders tell them they are evil scum of the earth if they don't stay firmly in the closet, and a threat to civilization itself, and constantly fearful that the honor code Stasi and their network of spies and informers will judge them to be disobedient and expel them from their courses. This is clearly developing quickly into a watershed moment. The apostles drawing a line in the sand and making clear they intend now to ramp up their polarizing conflict with anyone and everyone hoping and speaking for reforms and future-proofing changes in the church to end the lingering bigotries in LDS thought and culture that make it so hard to keep participating in or feel loyal to. We are no longer in a shared space of mutual respect and dialogue. They have drawn battle lines and declared their intention to never change anything, whatever the cost, even if they destroy BYU and your ward in the process. This, of course, confirms precisely the analysis of our situation and what is going to play out in the next few years that I have been discussing and researching and mapping out in the Mormon Civil War podcast, so I couldn't let this crucial moment pass without an episode about it. Jeffrey repeatedly used and magnified Dallin Oakes's metaphor of making sure our, quote, muskets are pointed towards those people and their advocates and anyone else discussing the dysfunctions of the church and its leaders, which was both unfortunate and grossly irresponsible, considering America's endemic gun culture, which leads to far too many LGBTQ Mormons killing themselves in different ways, including shooting themselves with guns. And there is a small but disproportionately armed to the teeth faction of American Mormons who are end-time prepper vigilantes, who have accumulated weapons first and food second in their emergency survivalist packs and food storage, and can't wait to use them on anyone they conclude is their enemy. I will be looking at the origins and development of this obsession with persecuting and fighting LGBTQ people, their civil rights, their self-esteem, and what Dallin Oakes keeps calling their, quote, agenda, and showing how everything Elder Holland said is simply repeating things the LDS leaders have been carefully teaching him to believe unchanged for decades. We will hear a much more intelligent and inspiring talk given by the young BYU valedictorian he threw under the bus in his polemic. And I will be discussing my theory about the impact of patriarchal male autism on the way the most influential general authorities think, and how it is they live with themselves while intentionally inflicting suffering on vulnerable groups and increasingly choosing ideology over humanity as they destroy the church they have been entrusted with protecting. This will then segue neatly into episode 8b, in which I will simply read you the letter I just sent to the First Presidency, appealing my excommunication, as is my right, and speaking to them clearly about what they have done to us, and what will need to change for the church not to end up as a tiny remnant of fanatics unable to cope with the modern world like the Amish. In one of the most unexpected twists I never thought I'd see, we have an actual global pandemic going on, and I have not heard anyone in the fundamentalist wing of the church hit the signs of the times panic button. If COVID had happened in the 1980s, that would have been it. Every conversation and lesson on a Sunday would have been quoting bits of the Book of Revelation about plagues killing a third of the population of the earth, and half the British wards would be rowing across the Atlantic to Missouri. But because most of the nutjobs who usually lap this stuff up have decided to be COVID-denying anti-vaxxers, they have jumped completely the other way, insisting it isn't really that bad, and they have been the ones turning on the prophet, a heart surgeon, for recommending, not commanding, that they should wear masks and get vaccinated so they don't die, like thousands of others who didn't get vaccinated and regretted it too late on their hospital deathbeds, including several of the LDS anti-vaxxer diehards, now giving interviews to newspapers and TV stations, warning their friends and families not to make the mistake they did, before dying the hard way and leaving their spouses and children bereaved. But the headbangers are definitely on board with rainbow flags and men holding hands as an end times plague that counts, and behaving more predictably regarding that. I think we are in an existential end times moment of crisis and a fight for survival. But my opinion is that the enemy at the gates taking our children from us and decimating the church is the fundamentalists, not the libtards in the dreaded world. I highly doubt Jesus is coming in any of our lifetimes. or the lifetimes of our mostly not going to be Mormon great-grandchildren. I trust Jesus when he said no one should speculate about a date because he doesn't even know. Right now, fanatical Mormons are bringing about the destruction of their own religion far more rapidly than anything someone outside it could do to it. One of the several errors they are making is to ignore the Church's real history and trajectory. I have spoken at length in other episodes about how the founders of our religion made it a fundamental doctrine that we are all on a long journey of progression and learning new things as we go. So theologically, real Mormons should already be totally on board with continuing reform and changes as we proceed. But even while failing to understand that doctrine, if they just knew the full history of the Church, even basic stuff, they would realise that so far the LDS Church has always agreed that the social justice warriors were right all along. As Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." The overall moral consensus in even secular society does not become more depraved and selfish, but civilization evolves towards social justice, equality, freedom, democracy. The innovations in human thought that take hold and eventually become a shared consensus in free societies are not invented by evil people conspiring against us, as Pharisee Mormons like to frame their war with the world. There are some evil people conspiring against us, and several of them end up as senior leaders in religions, tragically. But their ideas and movements do not last or win hearts and minds. Innovations and movements for reform are usually based on people's lived experiences, clearly showing them that something is wrong and needs changing for something better, and in response to new discoveries by scientific and historical researchers. The knowledge comes first, then the agitation for reforms, not the other way round. In the case of society's attitudes towards LGBTQ people, this has included historical researchers proving that LGBTQ people have always been a part of society, not some kind of modern aberration. That significant historical figures our cultures admire and regard as making essential contributions to our civilization were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, like Alexander the Great, or computer genius and enigma code cracker Alan Turing, who was driven to suicide by Britain's barbaric criminalisation of homosexuals, but now appears on our £50 banknotes. It has included people actually hearing the stories and experiences of LGBTQ victims of lifelong persecution and misunderstanding that humanises them rather than silencing them. It has included astonishing developments in the scientific understanding of human biology and genetics and hormones, and the interaction of the two in epigenetics, that now provide plenty of evidence already that there are observable physical reasons for people experiencing a range of sexualities and gender identities. When history, lived experience, and science combine to prove something is real, it is incredibly hard for even fundamentalist religions to continue pretending they are not, and expect to control their members enough to prevent them accessing that information and discovering those truths. Despite intense efforts by uncompromising leaders, the LDS Church has never resisted indefinitely trends in society it used to consider a descent into Babylon on issues like women's rights and roles in society, contraception being a sin, evolution being a satanic lie, racism, marriages in which women are treated as property to be collected in large numbers for higher social status and tickets to VIP heaven, accuracy in history and believing things that are proven by the available evidence to be true. The LDS Church is still dragging behind the centre of gravity of where wider society is today, as is inevitable ever since it gave all leadership power to its most unimaginative, elderly and backward-looking members, but it is moving. Jeffrey Holland, who is paid $140,000 a year plus expenses for being an apostle, recently presented on the 7th of March 2021 a broadcast to the young LDS Institute students of Europe and Africa with millionairess Bonnie Cordon, the Young Women President, in which they both lied outrageously that they have always been poor and still have no money. So the kids should just get married immediately and make lots of babies, even if they cannot afford to support them, because God makes things work out on a shoestring or debt-ridden budget, like he did for them.
This is kind of a cultural question. We're talking to Western Europe, Eastern Europe, UK, Africa. We're talking to a lot of people. Well, we're talking to more than that by the time, that's just in English. And then we translate into so many languages. So this is kind of a cultural question, but I think it's the one we ought to talk about. A lot of questions about marriage, a lot of questions about dating. Is it a bad idea to get married before you have a good amount of savings in the bank? You and Derek didn't have any money in the bank. You don't have any money now.
We don't have any money now. Isn't that a tender question? Because I think, in the scriptures, it says, seek first the kingdom of God, and everything else will be given. And I think there's just a principle there that might be tender for all of us. I mean, we didn't have a cent in the bank. And then as we were studying, we went and had this beautiful baby boy, and we had to borrow money to get him out of the hospital. But the blessings that have come because we just followed what the Lord asked us to do, and that we just try. And I'm amazed at how the Lord opens windows, and sometimes they're tiny windows, but there's always a ray of sunshine. So I would seek first to do those things that the Lord's asked us to do, and I know he'll open the windows of heaven.
Great. Chad, any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great comment.
Bishop Kosei?
Perfect.
That is a perfect answer. But so many questions come in this regard, and more. I think in our 21st century, there's been more of an inclination to think, I've got to go on a mission, and we want you to do that. But then I've got to get in school, and then I've got to get out of school, and then I've got to ideally get a job, and then if I have a job, I'll get some money, and lo and behold, maybe you're 35 or 40 before this. Look, I'll add to Sister Corden. If Sister Holland and I had waited till we had money, we still wouldn't be married. And we've been married for 58 years. I'd have lost 58 good years if we waited for any money. You need to worry about some things, but you shouldn't worry too much about money. You need to be honorable. You need to be able to be responsible and keep food on the table and pay your bills, but you don't need much. You don't need much to live on, really, truly. And if you'll pray, it's a kind of an individual question. It'll be different for some than from others. But I love what Sister Corden said, and I add that because so many have asked that question and wonder whether, when is it right, when is it time, and the Lord will bless. The Lord will bless us.
The wealth and privileges these two have are huge, much of it paid for by the tithing of poor institute students over the years, as they were both heavily subsidised students at BYU, and he was its president for years. And Bonnie owns her own company, and her husband is a wealthy executive of global tech companies. She tells stories of growing up on a farm in Idaho, but her father, Harold Hillam, was a well-paid mission president and general authority in the First Quorum of 70 and a successful orthodontist. She joked about having to borrow money from the bank to get her baby out of hospital. Some of the African students they were speaking to are in countries that don't have stable banking systems, and where getting into debt young could lead to lifelong poverty you never escape from. It was obscene, not just listening to these people lying about their own wealth, but telling the young people effectively not to be financially self-sufficient when it comes to baby making and managing their family finances, when the church is at the same time pressurizing all members to be financially self-sufficient and not dependent on church and state welfare systems in a world where living expenses are going through the roof. These contradictory messages to young Latter-day Saints are confusing and set them up to have lives of poverty, struggling to support the many children the apostles tell them to have, and then pay for them to serve full-time missions for 2 years, followed by college education, while at the same time setting the whole LDS community up to shame them for not being wealthy and providing all this extra money themselves because they were told to prioritise childbearing over university education and securing careers that might be able to cover the costs involved, which in most cases means the mother stops her education and career. And then, when more than half of these young marriages, stressed out by overwhelming parenting, end in divorce, she is totally screwed, as she usually gets left with the children and trying to get a job to feed them without the qualification she might have had by ignoring the lying fat cats and taking care of her financial future sensibly first. The working mothers who won the prize. A third ingredient of Bonnie Cordon and Jeffrey Holland's parade of deceptive and terrible advice that really got to me was Elder Holland's statement, quote, "You don't need much. You don't need much to live on. Really, truly," close quote. Every time I challenge church members to justify why our general authorities should be paid salaries of $140,000 in the top 10% of wages in the USA and UK, plus huge expenses allowances, while they tell all of us to live extremely frugally and be content with little, and pay tithing even if we are destitute, and expect people their age to serve full-time missions and in other callings requiring lots of travel, all paid for from their own savings. The response, especially from Americans who seem to regard raw capitalism as fundamental to Christianity, is that this is the least they deserve, since they could be making that much or more in their previous careers, or if they were doing equivalent leadership jobs in capitalist corporations. This totally ignores the fact that this is meant to be a religion, not a profit-making enterprise, that most of the general authorities are far beyond retirement age, so there is no reason they could not be living and serving on their pensions like everyone else in the church does. And we keep teaching that being paid for being priesthood holders is a sin called priestcraft. No one has any problem with what President Hinckley dishonestly called a modest stipend for full-time general authorities if their own resources are not covering the not very much they really need to live on. But what the general authorities have justified to themselves taking from church funds as huge salaries when they mostly don't need any of it is the complete opposite to everything the gospel teaches about money and leaders being our servants rather than wealthy kings entitled to riches beyond most of our wildest dreams. They do not practice what they preach, and Jesus' most often repeated name for such Pharisee leaders was hypocrites. That shameless lying obviously got the most attention in that broadcast, but Jeffrey also made a comment more relevant to the issues raised by his recent MUSKET speech at BYU and the entrenched resistance to the modern world of the general authorities that is alienating those young students. He described his discomfort at the track record of the church to follow the trends in wider society as something bad rather than essential to the church's survival.
We can certainly say he is for marriage, He is for families. He does love children. And culturally, here's kind of what happens. The world is here, and we're more conservative here, and we're not going to do what the world does, live together or never get married or whatever. But as the world progresses, cultures change. They go here, and then we go here, and then they go here, and we go here, and before long, you look up and we're perilously close where we would never have thought to be before. So let's stay fixed on gospel principles and not cultural issues and not the societal commitments of the time. I've said too much. Sister Corden said it best.
There are sensible reasons why the Church has so far followed the trajectory of the world to eventually correct its more evil or stupid ideas and practices. The modern world was clear that polygamy is barbaric, so eventually we stopped letting our men have multiple sexual partners at once, and told them to wait till their next life for that, but get sealed to them in serial monogamy for now. The modern world was clear that institutional white supremacism and racist segregation is barbaric, so we mostly stopped doing that 33 years after the Nazi racist genocides, although Dallin Oaks is still teaching that it was God's will all along. He just can't tell us a single reason why, so we stopped racially segregating our priesthood and temples. The modern world was clear that histories written about people like Joseph Smith, with lives thoroughly documented by themselves and their contemporaries in the modern age, should be based on the contents of all those documents, not locking the documents up and inventing a rose-tinted and severely censored fairy tale for people to read about instead. So the Church started admitting what the documents contain, and publishing them online. Everything points to the Church eventually changing to accept female ordination to the priesthood and full LGBTQ equality. But if they don't make that happen much faster than most people who are expecting that to happen are expecting that to happen, it will be far too late to save the Church, and we will lose our future generations with no way to replace them in the next 10 to 15 years. So what are you going to do now in response to that stark reality? Double down and wait for death? Or get out of your comfort zone and ruffle some feathers on a Sunday or in social media? What if you could go back in time 10 years and do something to accelerate those inevitable epiphanies and reforms? Think of me as that guy, because I am that guy. I'm living your future in 10 years' time. I'm sat in the centre of a perfect storm of all the dysfunctions in the Church and the inevitable chickens coming home to roost. It is probably far too late to save my ward with the best will in the world, but we could have done 10 years ago when we still had a primary and an amazing generation of sparky young single adults after 20 years of concerted effort by their parents and the ward and stake members to hold on to them and keep them to some extent engaged with our religion. With a final push of brilliant support from a hard-working missionary couple who provided them with loads of food and freewheeling conversations about the Mormon doctrines that thrilled me at their age and fed their minds. Most of them went on full-time missions. In the last 10 years, 11 of them got married. 4 are divorced already. 7 are inactive. 2 are still married and active. 5 are still married and inactive. It has proven more than twice as healthy for young marriages in my ward to stop coming to church than to be an active Latter-day Saint. I would change a whole host of things to prevent the suffering and disillusionment those lovely people have been put through already in their young lives, when they should still just be starting out and hopeful. So my whole thing is to have as big an impact as possible, adding my voice to all the others, pleading with the leaders and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to make radical reforms very quickly, so that it stops harming and alienating its own members, and maybe, just maybe, there will still be a functioning LDS church to go to in my country and continent, and yours, when I retire in 17 years. Thank you again to all of you listeners for the amazing support and validation and ideas and feedback you have given me to cheer me on and contribute to the content of this podcast. Pied Piper Packer and the Dodo. The Mormon Civil War is heating up, and every week seems to bring a new event, dear boy. This week's event was Jeffrey Holland speaking to all the staff at the Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah on the 23rd of August 2021. Like he did on the 10th of November 2018 in his speech to the Maxwell Institute of BYU, titled The Maxwell Legacy in the 21st Century, he kicked their butts for being objective and academically credible in their research and publications, and delusionally told them to instead become assertive, biased propagandists for the Pharisee version of Mormonism, or be defunded and fired by their owners, the First Presidency. And he told them to stop being so tolerant of the homosexuals, because the fundamentalist Pharisee Mormon students and parents and donors were complaining to him that their kids might as well go to any other university where they might see a rainbow flag, or someone saying gay students should be allowed to hold hands in public. What on earth is the point of BYU if it can't be the most intolerant and homophobic university in America? Why should their kids have to deal with the real world when the whole point was to shield them from it and pretend the queer people don't exist? Quoting Russell Nelson and Dallin Oaks of the First Presidency, whose ideas he was channeling, Apostle Holland told them to abandon the rational Christian Mormon religion I was raised in and still believe in, the rational faith that only seeks to believe and teach the truth, which believes that truth prevails. Ironically, he ended his speech by saying,
"Light conquers darkness. Truth triumphs over error. Goodness is victorious over evil. In the end, every time."
I totally agree, which is why, eventually, this talk will be disavowed by the Church's First Presidency, like they disavowed so many others delivered with similar conviction by apostles at BYU or General Conference pulpits, usually trying to justify institutional racism as an eternal concept that cannot be compromised just because it seems cruel. The inconvenient truth that keeps the homophobic LDS apostles and prophets anxious and awake at night is that all the certainty they claim and proclaim about LGBTQ people and same-sex marriage having no place at all in God's plan for humanity. So what the LGBTQ people should do is shut up, be celibate monks and nuns, and forego relationships and family life if they aren't willing to give a mixed orientation marriage a punt, which usually ends in divorce and disaster, and wait for God to fix things in the next life, and how this isn't unfair at all from an eternal perspective, exactly matches the certainties and rhetoric their predecessors used to preach about black people. How black people are cursed by God for being descendants of Cain, the murderer son of Adam and Eve, and Noah's naughty son Ham, and for being lazy fence-sitters in the first phase of the civil war we are all fighting in the pre-existence. forbidden to have the priesthood until every person of every other race has been offered it first, how people of other races must not marry them, or they and their children will be contaminated. White people who married black people used to have their temple recommends withdrawn. And while we are at it, all races and even social classes of people should only marry their own kind, which they also used to teach. But now most of that is history, and the Church's uncompromising doctrine totally changed. They not only fast-forwarded the day of ordaining black people to this side of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, they even went as far as abandoning and formally publicly disavowing all the reasons once taught for the black people being cursed and contaminated. In 1949, in the aftermath of the Second World War, as the world was trying to come to terms with learning the full horrors of the Holocaust, perpetrated by highly indoctrinated Nazi racists and homophobes on races they considered inferior and homosexual people. There were understandable questions about how on earth the LDS Church could still justify its own intense racist ideology and segregation, keeping people with a single black African ancestor out of its priesthood and temples. On the 17th of August 1949, the First Presidency of President George Albert Smith, J. Reuben Clark, and David O. McKay issued an official statement or proclamation about the status of the Negro in Mormonism, in which they doubled down on this racist belief and segregation as a fundamental doctrine, not a policy, and tried to spin it as reasonable because the black people could have the blessings being forbidden to them, like priesthood ordination and being sealed to their spouses and families in the next life. So they should just be patient and wait for that, while everyone around them at church was merrily carrying on, getting ordained and receiving temple endowments and getting married for time and all eternity and being sealed to their children as eternal families in the temples. They were not even allowed to set foot in as cleaners. They said there was no injustice in any of this because the black people were just lucky and grateful to be allowed to be born and come to our church even without those things. Quote, "The attitude of the church with reference to Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of the declaration of a policy, but of direct commandments from the Lord, on which is founded the doctrine of the Church from the days of its organization, to the effect that Negroes may become members of the Church, but that they are not entitled to the priesthood at the present time. The prophets of the Lord have made several statements as to the operation of the principle. President Brigham Young said, quote, "Why are so many of the inhabitants of the earth cursed with a skin of blackness? It comes in consequence of their fathers rejecting the power of the holy priesthood and the law of God. They will go down to death, and when all the rest of the children have received their blessings in the holy priesthood, then that curse will be removed from the seed of Cain, and they will then come up and possess the priesthood and receive all the blessings which we now are entitled to." Close quote. President Wilford Woodruff made the following statement, quote, "The day will come when all that race will be redeemed and possess all the blessings which we now have." Close quote. The position of the Church regarding the Negro may be understood when another doctrine of the Church is kept in mind, namely that the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence has some determining effect upon the conditions and circumstances under which these spirits take on mortality. And while the details of this principle have not been made known, the mortality is a privilege that is given to those who maintain their first estate, and that the worth of the privilege is so great that spirits are willing to come to earth and take on bodies no matter what the handicap may be as to the kind of bodies they are to secure, and that among the handicaps, failure of the right to enjoy in mortality the blessings of the priesthood is a handicap which spirits are willing to assume in order that they might come to earth. Under this principle, there is no injustice whatsoever involved in this deprivation as to the holding of the priesthood by the Negroes. The First Presidency. Close quote. Listen out later for Boyd K. Packer reasoning that other groups suffering injustices at the hands of church doctrine and policy are not experiencing anything wrong and should be content if we just teach them the plan of salvation. One of the best memes that has been created in response to Jeffrey Holland's Musket Gate compared the 1949 Proclamation on the Negro with what he said about LGBTQ people. We will hear much more of his speech later, but the meme focused on these statements from it, as well as the larger LDS themes that were fundamental to both bigotries of forbidding marriage. Quote, "Your trustees are not deaf or blind to the feelings that swirl around marriage and the whole same-sex topic on campus. We have spent hours discussing what the doctrine of the Church can and cannot provide the individuals and families struggling over this difficult issue. If a student commandeers a graduation podium to announce his personal sexual orientation, what might another speaker feel free to announce the next year until eventually anything goes? We have to be careful that love and empathy do not get interpreted as condoning and advocacy. Christ never once said to anyone, 'Because I love you, you are exempt from keeping my commandments.' Musket fire? Yes, we will always need defenders of the faith. There will continue to be those who oppose our teachings, and with that will continue the need to define, document, and defend the faith." Close quote. These kinds of declarations that they will never compromise, never abandon what are declared to be such fundamental eternal truths, just ring laughably hollow. Now we have lived as a church through our prophets and apostles totally abandoning such certainties regarding polygamy being the only way to reach the upper levels of the celestial kingdom and become gods, or the ruthlessly enforced 150 years of racist doctrine and segregation. It is now simply ludicrous to insist that they are that right about anything, or that anything in their doctrines will never change and must therefore be defended to the death, whatever it costs. And they know it. Christian Mormonism is confident that its truth claims can hold up under any kind of research or critical analysis, and that if they turn out not to be able to hold up when scrutinized and ponderized, they should be abandoned or adjusted for more truthful truth claims on our long journey from our fog of ignorance, seeing through a glass darkly, to one day understanding all truth, and with that knowledge becoming gods ourselves. Elder Holland told the BYU faculty, as he did in 2018, to stop worrying about the academic world treating their courses and qualifications as credible or real anymore, as if a university can even be a university and expect students to want to go to it when no one else recognises its teaching and qualifications as real or meets academic and professional standards. The current dominant general authorities, thinking like the lawyers and business managers most of them are self-destructing our religion by being anti-religion, as they turn LDS Mormonism into a massive money-generating operation. They don't seem to understand even the most basic scriptures, Mormon doctrines, or even the parables of Jesus. They are still quoting the parable of the talents as an instruction to hoard our tithing donations in the stock market and build up a fortune of gold, as if that's what the parable is actually talking about. I know it seems impossible, but that really, really is, literally, what the First Presidency and presiding bishopric are saying in their official statements and impromptu remarks. That the parable of the talents teaching us to share everything we have with the people of the world so that they are inspired to pay that kindness forward and exponentially grow it, instead of fearfully withholding it from the poor and needy in case it doesn't get used exactly as you want it to, is in their addled brains an instruction from Jesus of Nazareth, the champion of the poor, to rob widows and the destitute of their money and tell the destitute to pay it to them instead of feeding their own hungry children, and make a killing in the stock market with the money they hand over. That alone is surely enough to prove they are utterly incompetent and unqualified for their claimed authority as both disciples of the same Christ and the leaders of a Christian denomination, never mind all the other evidence stacked up against their credibility. I found Jeffrey Holland's The Second Half of the Second Century speech to be the exact equivalent of what they are doing to our religion, applied to university education and learning truth, both as a concept and as a specific reality in how they rule the church's 4 all-American universities, which are paid for by 15 to 20% of everyone's tithing. In both endeavours, they are getting the wrong end of a very short and simple stick, and using their war on LGBTQ people as the mechanism to destroy the church and the universities. Or maybe we shouldn't use the collective term they and just say Dallin Oaks, because he and his ideology are now the official ideology of the church and its education system overseers. He is the real ruler of the LDS Church. Like the authoritarian Pharisees who went before him taking control of the church's agenda, such as Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, Ezra Taft Benson and Boyd K. Packer, he is assertive and uncompromising in his declarations of what the doctrine and path of the church must be, and has clearly bullied his colleagues into meek compliance with his purpose in life to fight what he calls the LGBTQ agenda. He has been fighting this crusade for a long time. As BYU Provo President for 9 years from 1971, when I was born there, to British students, until 1980, Dallin Oaks supervised a McCarthy-like surveillance and blackmail operation to identify and control the homosexual students. He used the BYU police to follow them to places they met up in secret off campus. Any that were identified were interrogated by the Honor Code Gestapo and blackmailed to try and persuade them to reveal who the other gay students were, and then given a stark choice. Engage with the on-campus aversion therapy program using gay porn and electric shocks or nausea-inducing drugs to cure their deviant sexuality, or be outed and shamed and expelled from the university, losing the money they had spent on their courses and all their credits earned so far. The victims of this system of persecution have been telling their experiences for a long time now. Having proved his ruthless homophobic credentials, Dallin Oaks was then appointed as an apostle on the 3rd of May 1984 and immediately given the assignment as a senior lawyer to prepare and run the church's campaign of resistance to the shift in society towards giving homosexual and transgender people freedom from criminalization and prison sentences for their sexuality and gender identity, civil rights, legal protections, and eventually legally recognised same-sex marriages. Dallin got to work and 3 months later had prepared and presented his colleagues with a written game plan dated the 7th of August 1984, titled Principles to Govern Possible Public Statement on Legislation Affecting Rights of Homosexuals. They have pretty much stuck with Dallin's strategy plan ever since. You can read it for yourself online. It basically involves cynically conceding on points that don't impact the church religiously, like legal protections in housing and the secular workplace, to give the church some credibility and propaganda opportunities to appear compassionate and reasonable in its treatment of homosexual people and their rights, but to hold the line on things like secular same-sex marriage and the church's right to discriminate against homosexual people in its own practices, marriages and employment protocols. The stated desire in the document to ideally prevent homosexuals having any jobs in popular culture and entertainment and schools and as published authors so they cannot influence young people or normalise their place in society was obviously delusional, but indicates the amazing control the LDS apostles think they do or should have over wider secular society, or arguably actually do in Mormon-dominated American states like Utah and Idaho. The document also foreshadows their current focus on framing the church's rights to be homophobic in its teaching and practices as an issue of religious freedom. Ever since this first assignment, Dallin has clearly seen his reason for being called by God as an apostle, and his destiny in that role as completely entwined with the mission to fight the gays. And you can only imagine how much finding himself now in the First Presidency, and next in line to be the president of the church, has validated and confirmed that sense of divine approval and destiny for him and the church he leads now. One of the funniest things about the Apostle Briefing films that got leaked to Mormon Leaks is counting how many times Dallin asks the presenters if anyone in any field described as a potential threat to the church is a homosexual. He is exactly as obsessed with his homophobia in private as he is at the pulpit. What you see and hear is what he is. Dallin seems to have been the main author of the proclamation on the family they created in 1995 after their attempts to involve the church in being consulted by the judiciary and legislature of the state of Hawaii when it was the first in the USA to consider legalizing same-sex marriage were rebuffed, since the church had no specific published articles of faith opposing same-sex marriage. And of course, neither the Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants mention homosexuality anywhere. The proclamation reinforces what the General Authorities like to call traditional gender roles, as if now in our religion, with its long track record of breaking all kinds of what it regards as false apostate traditions, we suddenly respect cultural traditions as intrinsically authoritative and right now. The proclamation proclaims that women are primarily responsible for nurturing children in the home, and men should be the earners in the paid workplace. Marriage being monogamous between one man and one woman, which is rather hypocritical, and gender identity being something that is intrinsic to our spirits before we are born and an essential aspect of our eternal nature, with no scriptural support for that idea whatsoever. Ironically, they have since discovered that this concept can be argued to support the belief of transgender people that yes, they do indeed have an eternal gender, that is an essential characteristic of their eternal spirit, but that it has been matched with the wrong or ambiguously gendered body in their mortal turn on earth, which may be one of the reasons some leaders are hesitant to canonize it. It certainly doesn't allow for the millions of people born intersex, with physical and genetic characteristics of male and female, and inconveniently, most people are now aware that intersex people exist, and that acting quickly to do a bit of surgery when they are born to tidy things up one way or another, usually removing a penis as the easiest option surgically, has not turned out well when those people grow up and conclude their parents and surgeons made the wrong choice for them. A religion with rigid, binary, cisgender and heterosexual certainties cannot even begin to cope with the real diversity going on in both situations. So it has no choice but to ask everyone to stay quiet about it and pretend they don't exist if they are one of those people, and ideally to rack off and take their children with them, because we are trying to sell the idea that they cannot possibly have healthy and happy marriages and families. Dallin is desperate to have his family proclamation officially canonized by the Church. None of the other apostles seem to be backing him up so far. Still no common consent vote to accept it as scripture. Or perhaps he is terrified that if they did have a vote, it would remind everyone that votes should be happening all the time, and nothing the general authorities have declared to be a policy or proclamation or doctrinal since 1978 is actually authorised, since that's the last time they allowed a vote about a policy. One can only imagine the agonies he is going through trying to decide between his urge to cast his proclamation baby in stone forever and the terror of unleashing a Pandora's box of democracy in the Church that he knows will liberate the members to modernise fast and sweep away the extreme social conservatism and homophobia he has been fighting the world to defend. He is not the first to try to unilaterally canonise the proclamation. In October 2010 General Conference, in a talk called Cleansing the Inner Vessel, his mentor and president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, Boyd K. Packer, taught that the family proclamation qualified as a revelation to the Church, but President Monson was lucid enough still to slap him down for it and have the word revelation removed from the written version of his talk in the Ensign. This was pretty extraordinary. Packer was at the time next in line to be president of the Church, so only President Monson had seniority to him. Despite some progress where the Church seemed to be accepting that people are born LGBTQ and was making a distinction between being LGBTQ not being in itself a sin, but doing LGBTQ things being the sin, Packer doubled down on the Pharisee McConkie Mormon certainties of the past and insisted that God would never allow someone to be born that way, so it was wrong to claim that people are. He described non-cisgendered or heteronormative sexualities and gender identities as impure and unnatural perversions, temptations and addictions that can be cured and repented of, and really went to town predicting calamities for society if these people were given civil rights and legal marriages. He clearly laid down boundaries. Sexualities that his religion forbids should be illegal in law, and LGBTQ people cannot be regarded as worthy members of the Church. Remember, he was making no distinction between sexuality and actions. To him, just identifying as LGBTQ makes you unworthy because it is a choice.
This General Conference was convened at a time when there is such confusion and such danger that our young people hardly know which way they can walk. 15 years ago, with the world in turmoil, the First Presidency of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles issued the family a proclamation to the world, the fifth proclamation in the history of the Church. It qualifies, according to the definition, as a revelation, and would do well that the members of the Church to read and follow. Pure love presupposes that only after a pledge of eternal fidelity, a legal and lawful ceremony, and ideally after a sealing ordinance in the temple, are those life-giving powers released to the full expression of love. It is to be shared only and solely between man and woman, husband and wife, with that one who is our companion forever. On this gospel is the very plan.
He was fumbling his words a bit. That last phrase was meant to be, quote, "On this the gospel is very plain," close quote. Note here the complete erasure of plural marriage, including the temple-sealed plural marriages of Presidents Nelson and Oakes. Boyd K. Packer describes marriage of one man to one woman and said, quote, "with that one who is our companion forever," close quote, not 2 or 46.
The priesthood holds consummate power. It can protect you from pornography, and it is a plague if you are succumbing to its influence. If one is obedient, the priesthood can show you how to break a habit, even erase an addiction. The holders of the priesthood have authority and should employ it to cast out these influences.
This is very weird and intriguing language. He earlier mentioned that pornography predominantly enters families and marriages through the priesthood holder presiding in the home, as he put it, quote, "relentlessly trying to invade every home, most frequently through the husband and father," close quote. But now he's saying that having the priesthood is some kind of pornography-repelling superpower that, quote, "protects you from the plague of pornography," close quote, and can, quote, "show you how to break a habit, even erase an addiction," close quote, and that priesthood holders can literally use their power to cast pornography out of themselves or maybe others, like an exorcism. One thing I've been learning in all these hours of analysing General Authorities talks is that one of the key indicators of a Pharisee that separates them from Christians is that they contradict themselves a lot. They offer what sound like pompous and authoritative certainties, usually delivered with utmost seriousness. But when you actually rationally analyse what they say and follow the trains of thought they are connecting together, they keep reaching a point where they become derailed and contradictory. Apparently, whoever was taking a censor's scalpel to this talk before it was published in the conference report edition of the Ensign felt the same. The whole talk is such a relentless tour de force of doom and fear and hyperbole, it is impossible to do much to fix its overall embarrassing negative impact for the Church's credibility. And Packer's well-earned reputation as an uncompromising fundamentalist fanatic with zero understanding of the harm he was doing and real people's lives. But they locked off a few of the most extreme bits here and there. In the published texts, the idea that all you need to do is use your priesthood to exorcise or cast out of people the demons of pornography and actual addictions was carefully removed and replaced. Quote, "The holders of the priesthood have that authority and should employ it to cast out these evil influences," close quote, was subtly changed to, quote, "Holders of the priesthood have that authority and should employ it to combat evil influences," close quote. He continued the fear-mongering by telling parents that their families are under constant threat of being invaded by same-sex marriages, that he explained earlier are exactly what Satan favours because they stop you being able to have children, so you end up childless like him.
We raise an alarm and warn members of the church to wake up and understand what's going on. Parents, be alert, ever watchful that this wickedness might threaten your family circle. We teach a standard of moral conduct that will protect us from Satan's many substitute counterfeits for marriage. We must understand that any persuasion to enter into any relationship that is not in harmony with the principles of the gospel must be wrong. From the Book of Mormon, we learn that wickedness never was happiness. Some suppose that they were preset and cannot overcome what they feel are inborn tendencies toward the impure and the unnatural. Not so. Why would our Heavenly Father do that to anyone? Remember, He is our Father. Paul promised, God will not suffer you to be tempted above what ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. You can, if you will, break the habits and conquer the addiction and come away from that which is not worthy of any member of the church. As Alma cautioned, we must watch and pray continually. Isaiah warned to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, and put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Years ago, I visited a school in Albuquerque. The teacher told me about a youngster who brought a kitten to class. As you can imagine, that disrupted everything. She had him hold up the kitten in front of the children. It went well until one of the children asked, "Is it a boy kitty or a girl kitty?" Not wanting to get into that lesson, the teacher said, "It doesn't matter. It's just a kitty." But they persisted. Finally, one boy raised his hand and said, "I know how you can tell." Resigned to face it, the teacher said, "How can you tell?" And the students answered, "You can vote on it." You may laugh at the story, but if we're not alert, there are those today who not only tolerate but advocate voting to change laws that would legalize immorality, as if a vote would somehow alter the designs of God's laws and nature. A law against nature would be impossible to enforce. For instance, what good would the law vote against the law of gravity do? There are both moral and physical laws irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundation of the world that cannot be changed. History demonstrates over and over again that moral standards cannot be changed by battle and cannot be changed by ballot. To legalize that which is basically wrong or evil will not repent the pain and penalties that will follow as surely as night follows day. Regardless of the opposition, we are determined to stay on course. We will hold to the principles and laws and ordinances of the gospel. If they are misunderstood, either innocently or willfully, so be it. We cannot change. We will not change the moral standard. We quickly lose our way when we disobey the laws of God. If we do not protect and foster the family, civilization and our liberties must needs perish. I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say, but when you do not what I say, you have no promise. Every soul confined to the prison of sin, or guilt, or perversion, has a key to the gate. The key is labeled repentance. If you know how to use it, this key, the adversary cannot hold you. For those who truly desire, there is a way back. Repentance is like unto a detergent. Even ground and stains of sin will come out. Priesthood holders carry with them the antidote to remove the terrible images of pornography and wash away guilt. The priesthood has the power to unlock the influence of our habits, even to unchange from addiction, however tight the grip. It can heal over the scars of the past mistakes.
In the Ensign, the written text of his talk was altered. It qualifies according to definition as a revelation, and it would do well that the members of the church to read and follow, was changed to, it is a guide that members of the church would do well to read and follow. Some suppose that they are preset and cannot overcome what they feel are inborn tendencies towards the impure and the unnatural. Not so, was changed to, inborn temptations. And why would our Heavenly Father do that to anyone? Remember, He is our Father was changed to remember, God is our Heavenly Father. So 5 years after the family proclamation, there was already enough of a shift occurring towards accepting that people are born LGBTQ among the prophet and apostles that they purged Packer's talk of his denials of this, although all the rest of his shameful disparaging of them could not be edited away. As usual, according to these apostles, stopping yourself being gay is simply a matter of willpower, and not thinking of yourself as gay anymore, and easy if you are determined.
Strange enough it be that the simplest and most powerful prevention and cure for pornography or any unclean act is to ignore and avoid it. Delete from the mind any unworthy thought that tries to take root. Once you decided to remain clean, you are asserting your God-given agency, and then, as President Smith counseled, don't look back.
Turn it off like a light switch. When they think changing your behaviour and even your sexuality or gender identity is that simple and easy, you can understand why they get so frustrated with church members who won't simply step into line and be like them in every way, and persist with our frustrating complications and diversity. On the 19th of November 2017, in the Ballard and Oaks face-to-face with the young adults, in which Apostle Russell M. Ballard told the massive lie that leaders of the church have never hidden anything from anybody, they were asked a question about how we should respond to LGBTQ people in the church. In their answers, Ballard emphasised that everyone has a place in the church, and Dallin Oaks said we should not verbally or physically bully them, which is ironic considering the recent consternation Jeffrey Holland kicked off, quoting Oaks, saying we should point metaphorical muskets at LGBTQ people who dare to speak publicly about their sexuality or advocate for their rights and inclusion, that I will go into in a bit. He then couldn't help himself telling the kids to just stop thinking of themselves as LGBTQ, and then it will go away. Like his Sith apprentice David Bednar taught when he said there are no homosexual Mormons, and they shouldn't define themselves by such names.
Our next question, we have had a number of questions come in about same-gender attraction. So these two are pretty representative of what we have received. So a young single adult from Brazil asked, what would be important for a homosexual young adult to know to stay firm in the gospel, and how can a heterosexual young adult help? And then it says, and a young adult from New York says, the world seems very frustrated with our beliefs on same-gender attraction. How can we show our love to them despite our differences?
This is subject to many of the questions we received. We want to be helpful on this. It's a concern with many, with some personally and with others in behalf of their friends or family members. I'll just start off by repeating something that was told to me by a proud grandparent, saying they had a grandson who was struggling with this problem, and he said, I'm satisfied that I can approach this problem in this way. I'm not going to let my sexuality interfere with my spirituality. I thought that was, in a nutshell, an expression of faith and determination, not to get one thing confused with another.
I certainly endorse that, but I think we also we have to be cautious and willing to listen. We have to be willing to talk to one another about this issue. And for members of the church, there's 2 or 3 things to remember. One is that we make covenants, and then we're striving in our lifetime to keep those covenants. And in the process of that, those who have same gender attraction are God's children. He loves them. There's a place for them. And for all of our Father's children, regardless of what their circumstances may be, the church is a place of refuge, a place to come and find peace and the answers to life's questions. But ultimately, there are covenants that come into the picture, and all of us have to make that decision in our lives of entering into the sacred covenants that the Lord has told us are important in this journey of mortality. So I think we want to be loving and try to be understanding and try to explain the best that we can the importance of as it relates to the covenants of the gospel. And as all of us strive to keep our covenants, then all the blessings Heavenly Father has in store for His children will surely be given to them.
I just affirm that, and in furtherance of that, remind us that the covenant all of us have made is that we will be willing to bear one another's burdens. That's from the Book of Mormon, Messiah, chapter 18. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, and so fulfill the law of Christ. So loving one another, despite the differences that inevitably exist in the world along so many different lines, but across all of that is the commandment to love one another and help bear one another's burdens. And that comes first, especially in this subject where bullying and physical brutality and harassment have played a part. I hope never with Latter-day Saints, but verbal abuse, we hear a lot of reports of that, and we just encourage that we struggle with this very real problem in an atmosphere of love. There's one other thing that occurred to me, and that is we need to be cautious not to label ourselves or to label one another. The most important label any of us can carry throughout our life is I am a child of God. That very simple theme of our wonderful primary hymn. That's the important label that stays with us all our lives, and we shouldn't label ourselves as anti this or that or this or that, but carry on as children of God and realize that all of us have temptations and problems, inclinations, burdens that we're wrestling with, and if I were a bishop counseling each one of you, I would say don't label yourself as a this or that, whether the label is kleptomania or I'm from Texas. I single Texas out in that illustration because we all know how proud people are that they're from Texas.
And I apologize to all of the young single adults in Texas.
You see, he always rescues me, and I need it.
So, as usual, the official message is that people struggling and wrestling with the terrible temptation, problem, inclination, or burden of same-gender attraction are meant to be welcome and find peace and love in our church. But they can never leave it at that because they are Pharisee Mormons. They simply cannot cope with that being enough in itself. They also have to make clear that this offer of peace and love is highly conditional and very temporary. If you are going to be welcome to stay, you have to stop talking about your sexuality. Stop acknowledging that it is an important part of yourself. In fact, stop identifying as LGBTQ at all, because the only label that is valid is "I am a child of God." And then make sure you are strictly committing to the covenants of the Church that require lifelong celibacy or heterosexual marriage. As I've mentioned before, we saw this clash of two opposing religions, Christianity and Phariseeism, 12 minutes into President Nelson's inaugural press conference, when he recklessly invited everyone to return to our church and be loved there, because there is a place for everyone, regardless of their, quote, challenges. The word challenges being, as we have seen, often used as a Mormon jargon word for those pesky deviant sexualities. Dallin Oakes's head exploded, and he leaned in to Dallinsplain that, of course, was total nonsense, and what President Nelson really meant was that we are only welcome back as long as we keep the commandments and earn the highly conditional love of their fickle God of judgment and disapproval.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. McCombs. God loves his children, and he wants them to have joy. We know that there are challenges with the commandments of God, challenges to be worthy to enter his holy presence when we're through with this mortal experience. And we're trying to help people find happiness and joy in this life and prepare for their great possibilities in the world ahead. God loves his children, and we love them, and there's a place for everyone who wishes to do so, regardless of his challenges, to be with us in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Surely, President, your statement of the love of God for all of his children is the pole star for our relationship to every living person on this planet. At the same time, because of God's love for his children, he has given us commandments. He's given us a plan to achieve the highest blessings he has for his children. And as leaders of the church, we have the responsibility to teach love and also to teach the commandments of God and the high destination that he has prescribed for his children, all of which is embodied in the plan of salvation.
So we've got a love and law balance here that we have
the
to
love
consider.
of the Lord and the law of the Lord.
Yeah.
Thank you, brethren.
Poor Rusty. His brand new prophetic mantle as a mouthpiece of the real Jesus lasted precisely 55 seconds before Dallin knocked it off and stomped it into the floor. This was the funniest and most ruthless incident of the Pharisee apostles bullying the other apostles trying to be Christians, bar none. A close second is when Boyd K. Packer teased Thomas S. Monson for being too soft with his widow visiting in his 18th of May 1993 speech to the All-Church Coordinating Council, in which he told all his colleagues to toughen up and be uncompromising in public, and declared war on the women, the homosexuals, and the intellectuals. Amazingly, as I reread that speech today, it suddenly seemed very familiar. Boyd basically made in 1993 exactly the same points Jeffrey Holland made in his Musket speech at BYU. They really haven't changed their tune in all that time. Boyd read to his colleagues excerpts from letters written to him by a homosexual about his life of good and very hostile experiences with other church members, A woman who seems to be lamenting that she kept being told by her local church leaders to go back to a dangerous and abusive husband who just abused her more each time. And now she seems to have finally left him, is being told by the church that she has forfeited the celestial kingdom without an eternal marriage. He categorized this as a letter representing dangerous feminism, and a letter from an intellectual offering to be a go-between to facilitate conversation and peacemaking between the brethren and the scholars they were attacking. Probably including some of the September 6 who Packer was about to have excommunicated. Packer's monstrous response to all that pain, that he fully acknowledged as real, was to basically dismiss it as a distraction from more important things, and urged his brethren to prioritise the interests and opinions of the traditional fundamentalist church members unsettled by what they were hearing and seeing of church leaders empathising with these kinds of people who did not manage to live their lives precisely following the McConkie Mormonism script. Packer said to them, quote, "These letters and hundreds more are from members who are hurting or leaders who are worried. I might say here that I can see in the last few weeks a change in the letters coming in. There isn't time to talk about it now, but out in the church there is another growing group of the discontented. That is the rank and file who are trying to do what they are supposed to do and feel neglected as we concentrate on solving the problems of the exceptions. Those who are hurting think they are not understood. They are looking for a champion, an advocate, someone with office and influence from whom they can receive comfort. They ask us to speak about their troubles in general conference, to put something in the curriculum, or to provide a special program to support them in their problems or with their activism. When members are hurting, it is so easy to convince ourselves that we are justified, even duty-bound, to use the influence of our appointment or our calling to somehow represent them. We then become their advocates, sympathise with their complaints in the church, and perhaps even soften the commandments to comfort them. Unwittingly, we may turn about and face the wrong way. Then the channels of revelation are reversed. Let me say that again. Then the channels of revelation are reversed. In our efforts to comfort them, we lose our bearings and leave that segment of the line to which we are assigned unprotected. The question is not whether they need help and comfort. That goes without saying. The question is, how? The prophet Joseph Smith, when he organised the Relief Society, said, quote, "There is the need for decisions of character aside from sympathy." Close quote. Working mothers. To illustrate principles which apply to all of these problems, I've taken one common one. Working mothers. President Ezra Taft Benson gave a talk to wives and mothers. There was a reaction within the church. 10 years ago, that would not have happened. That was very interesting, because if you read his talk carefully, it was, for the most part, simply a compilation of quotations on the subject from the prophets who have preceded him. Some mothers must work out of the home. There is no other way. And in this they are justified, and for this they should not be criticised. We cannot, however, because of their discomfort over their plight, abandon a position that has been taught by the prophets from the beginning of this dispensation. The question then is, how can we give solace to those who are justified without giving license to those who are not? The comfort they need is better, for the most part, administered individually. To point out so-called success stories, inferring that a career out of the home has no negative effect on a family, is an invitation to many to stray from what has been taught by the prophets, and thus cause members to reap disappointment by and by. I think President Thomas S. Monson may not appreciate what I am going to say now. I know of no one who maintains such a large private ministry of counsel and comfort in the midst of heavy pressures of office than does Brother Monson. He says very little about it, but he visits the sick, hospitals, homes, comforting, counselling, both in person and in writing. However, I've never heard him over the pulpit, nor have I read anything in his writings, not one thing, that would give any licence to any member to stray from the counsel of the prophets, or to soften the commandments that the Lord has given. There is a way to give comfort that is needed. If we are not careful, we will think we are giving comfort to those few who are justified, and actually we will be giving licence to the many who are not. The process of correlation is designed to keep us from making mistakes in manuals, in publications, in films, in videos, in those specialised programs which are justified. Those 15 words from Alma state, quote, God gave unto them commandments, after having made known to them the plan of redemption, close quote. There are many things that cannot be understood, nor taught, nor explained, unless it is in terms of the plan of redemption. The 3 areas that I mention are among them. Unless they understand the basic plan, the premortal existence, the purposes of life, the fall, the atonement, the resurrection. Unless they understand that, the unmarried, the abused, the handicapped, the abandoned, the addicted, the disappointed, those with gender disorientation, or the intellectuals will find no enduring comfort. They can't think life is fair unless they know the plan of redemption. That young man with gender disorientation needs to know that gender was not assigned at mortal birth, that we were sons and daughters of God in the premortal state. The woman pleading for help needs to see the eternal nature of things and to know that her trials, however hard to bear, in the eternal scheme of things, may be compared to a very, very bad experience in the 2nd semester of the 1st grade. She will find no enduring peace in the feminist movement. There she will have no hope. If she knows the plan of redemption, she can be filled with hope. The one who supposes that he, quote, understands the mindset of both groups, close quote, needs to understand that the doctrines of the gospel are revealed through the Spirit to prophets, not through the intellect to scholars. Only when they have some knowledge of the plan of redemption will they understand the supposed inequities of life. Only then will they understand the commandments God has given us. If we do not teach the plan of redemption, whatever else we do by way of programs and activities and instructions will not be enough. Quote, God gave unto them commandments, after having made known unto them the plan of redemption, close quote. We face invasions of the intensity and seriousness that we have not faced before. There is the need now to be united, with everyone facing the same way. Then the sunlight of truth coming over our shoulders will mark the path ahead. If we perchance turn the wrong way, we will shade our eyes from that light, and we will fail in our ministries. God grants that a testimony of the redemption and knowledge of the doctrine will be so fundamentally in our minds and in our hearts that we will move forward with His approval. This church will prevail. There is no power in existence that can thwart the work in which we are engaged. Of that I bear witness, and of Him who is our Redeemer. I bear witness in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Close quote. Wow, This is precisely the worldview and game plan Jeffrey Holland prescribed to the faculty of BYU this week. He was ordained an apostle a year after that talk was given, in 1994. Interestingly, on the 23rd of June, months before a general conference in which he would be sustained or opposed by a common consent vote of the general church membership for the first time. Most apostles are voted for first and ordained on the Thursday after conference weekend. But Jeffrey Holland is one of the rogue apostles who, like the First Presidencies, was ordained without any authorization or institutional legitimacy at all, without a vote of the people first, in violation of Doctrine and Covenants 2065, which might explain a lot. Just as Packer taught, Jeffrey Holland privately acknowledged the pain the church is causing specific groups like homosexuals, but insistent that there cannot possibly be any reason to change anything, to adjust our rigid boundary policing and hardline preaching about the exact covenant path and lifestyle that our God insists is the only way to be acceptable or make it to the celestial kingdom. As soon as you show and normalize compassion for abused women, intellectuals and scholars who discover we have been lying to everyone, or homosexuals and lesbians and transgender people, it makes people question the unrealistically oversimplified fundamentals they have taught the fundamentalists to believe are the only safe path. So those people just need to suck it up and suffer for the greater good, and accept God doesn't approve of them, and his church has no intention of ever compromising on that position. There is a specific, well-documented, consistently advocated and fought for conspiracy to double down and dominate our church community by specific senior general authorities. They are confident, determined, and will do anything it takes to gain and keep power, and to manipulate or just bully into submission any of their colleagues who drift towards nuance and empathy for the church members whose diversity does not fit their rigid identikit life plan for us all, even when it is through no fault of their own. We must not even speak of homosexuals or working mothers who escaped abusive marriages having a good and successful life being different to that plan, in case it unleashes total chaos by making others think they can have more varied autonomy to Mormon as they see fit, and seems to work for their real lives. This Pharisee dogma is not just completely wrong, it doesn't actually work. Satan has duped them into destroying the church they think they are zealously and bravely protecting with their muskets, by squeezing it so tight that most of its members are forced out between their fingers. All of this begs the obvious question. How is it that these men who receive thousands of letters from church members their policies and rhetoric are hurting can still be so stubbornly cruel and indifferent to that suffering? How can a human being faced with all that pain still decide that their rules and regulations are more important than people or truth or reality? Well, there is a simple and to me obvious explanation. Mansplaining manifest destiny on the spectrum. In a church where all the important thinking and decision-making is done by men, it is important, I believe, to recognise the impact that has on what they normalise and expect of all of us, and how they presume God really wants things. The debates and research into the differences or lack of differences between male and female brains is still raging, and making any inference in this area can be stepping into a hornet's nest of very entrenched positions. But I think it is fair to say, and has certainly been my experience in family life and as a teacher in a school of mostly male students, that male psychology, whether genetic or learnt as a social construct or both, tends to prefer organising and categorising things into boxes and hierarchies, and concentrating on one thing at a time in a logical sequence. To generalise, on average, women are much more holistic in how they think and see connections between the boxes of data, relationships, feelings about them, and thus more intuitive, or better at acknowledging and factoring into their expectations of life and relationships the messy nuances and complexities of existence. One of the things I love about Mormonism is the temple endowment, which celebrates these female attributes rather than demonizing them as patriarchal cultures tend to. In the endowment, Adam's simple following of rules and not questioning them and staying inside the box is a disadvantage, potentially sabotaging our eternal progression. Eve has the skills to use multiple intelligences at once. Genesis describes her looking at the fruit and using her practical intelligence that the fruit is nutritious as food, her aesthetic intelligence that it is beautiful, and as an artist and art teacher, I of course fully approve of being willing to die for beauty, and her intellectual intelligence. The fruit will give her more knowledge. She also, of course, demonstrates plenty of other attributes usually attributed to males: adventurous exploration and eagerness to see and experience new things in new places, decisive leadership, making momentous decisions under pressure in confusing moments, and ultimately Christ-like attributes as the first avatar, or to use Mormon jargon, type of Christ. She chooses to become mortal and die to give all of humanity the opportunity for life and eternal life and progression. Sadly, though, a lot of this is lost on our apostles. As a special educational needs coordinator in my school for many years in the past, and living in a family with a hefty dose of Aspergers genes, we call them bleakly-chlorians, like the midi-chlorians in Star Wars that give the Jedi their sensitivity to the Force. I've spent a lot of time living with, supporting, and learning about people on the autistic spectrum. One of the most interesting things I heard in training that resonated with my experiences was that one way to conceptualize autism is as extreme maleness, and that males in general venture into that spectrum. Asperger's is a higher functioning end of the autism spectrum, and I'm pretty confident that several of our general authorities have Asperger's. Actually, I'm certain. They demonstrate the entire diagnostic list with bells on, and when you have been raised by Aspies, you can see it a mile off. But I'm not a qualified diagnostician, so cannot offer more than an opinion. And of course, several of our general authorities should be on the spectrum statistically. Current estimates are that 1 in 54 people is on the spectrum, and men are 4 times more likely than women to be. Some skill sets and careers favour people with Asperger's, particularly those that involve extreme focus and predictable structures and rules like science and maths, and being an inventor like my great-great-grandfather Sir Samuel Davidson, who was very rational and focused on his work, persisting with relentless engineering experiments. Although the heavier dose of bleakly-chlorians came to us through another line of ancestors, my great-grandfather James Bleakley, who was, drumroll, a maths teacher. Religion, with all its sensitivity to emotions and feelings and things that are hard to define and prove, should normally favour what we categorise as female attributes, and the ability to have extreme empathy for other people, which autistic people find extremely difficult. But one way to frame what has happened in Mormonism, as it has evolved from Joseph Smith's very intuitive, impulsive, visionary, and somewhat chaotic religion, into a rigid and certain machine of McConkian Packer Mormonism, is to understand it as a process of the Aspergic males taking over and reconfiguring it in their own image with certainty, allegedly unchanging rules, and repeatedly failing to cope with the reality and complexity of real human beings and their messy lives in the far too oversimplified and machine-like way they teach us to understand ourselves and how we should think and live. And when their inhumane paradigms for life, the universe and everything encounter something that doesn't fit into their tidy boxes of gender roles and sexuality and believing unrealistic fairy tales, their response is to double down and insist that those boxes and their boundaries cannot be changed, or it breaks the whole paradigm or religion, or as Packer describes it, the laws of God. You, messy human, must change to fit, or it must be that God requires you to be rejected and leave our community, because if you don't fit their rules, it must be your fault, not theirs. Not a problem with the boxes and the rules. Autism can have its advantages, and this is why it has persisted, along with ADHD and all kinds of other variations of the ways brains work, including LGBTQ brains. Autists are some of the greatest inventors and most reliable keepers of knowledge and laws that society needs. The hyperactive people noticing everything at once and fizzing with impulsive ideas can be creative pioneers and the best hunter-gatherers, seeing and tracking the slightest traces left in the forest by everyone's next meal. One of my most fidgety and impulsive and disruptive pupils was our secret weapon in the rugby team. He stayed off the Ritalin on match days, and it was like unleashing a Viking berserker on the opposing team. Homosexuals and bisexuals and transgender people bring all kinds of different perspectives and gifts to a society. Many cultures in the world, from Native Americans to Hindu Indians and Pacific Islanders, are fine with that, and culturally and legally recognise third genders and two-spirit people as offering unique gifts as spiritual leaders or just valid members of the community and the natural ecosystem. Same-sex behaviour, comprising courtship, sexual pair bonding, and parental activities, has been documented in over 450 species of animals worldwide, serving various purposes socially, and widening the number of pairs engaged in raising young when there is a shortage of one sex in the group. One of my son's best and favourite primary school teachers was a very camp, out and proud gay man, and LGBTQ people continue to make valuable, sometimes unique contributions to our well-being and culture, often informed, as Mormons outside Deseret are, by our experience of being a small and often misunderstood minority group in an often hostile or perplexed larger culture that expects things of us to fit in that we are unwilling or unable to do. Saying no to coffee and a pint is obviously far easier than dealing with homophobic attempted murder, but as Utah has sadly proven to us all, having everybody trying to be exactly the same in a culture totally obsessed with policing people's sex lives leads to disastrous shaming and coping strategies, which is why Mormon Utah has some of the highest rates of pornography, plastic surgery, and antidepressant consumption. It turns out the best way to really make a Zion on earth is to welcome diversity and tolerate a variety of lifestyles by consenting adults, rather than imposing totalitarian conformity. A simple lesson our general authorities should have learnt long ago, but are far too stubborn and indoctrinated to allow themselves to notice. One of the best ideas in Christianity is Paul's metaphor of the people of God being a body with very different parts and spiritual gifts coming together as a whole, and all having unique but essential contributions to make that cannot be provided by the parts that think they are the most important. That, I think, will need to be our theological starting point if we ever release the church from the Pharisee clutches in time to save it. If you are appreciating this podcast, you can attribute it in part to my dose of Aspergic bleakly chlorians that cannot sit still and be quiet when what I was taught and still believe are the fundamental rules and values of our religion are being blatantly contradicted by its current global leaders. Aspergic pupils in school often annoy their peers by being incredibly uptight sticklers for the rules, even in a casual knock-around football game at playtime, and speaking up to protest or tell on them to teacher. My stubborn determination that if people will just see reason, they could be saved from this contradictory confusion and suffering, and that some of the solutions really are simple and achievable, while most of my friends seeing the problems have concluded it is futile and have given up trying to change the church, is perhaps an example of how the sometimes difficult and inhibiting attributes of something like Asperger's or being the only gay in the village can be the thing that makes the difference and gives you the game-changing edge over the muggles. One of the many wise things my mother taught me, along with "don't get married until you really haven't anything better to do," was that every positive character trait is like a coin with a negative flip side that comes with the positive. So, for example, many really inspiring and charismatic leaders, I would say like Joseph Smith, come with a package of downsides like hubris and being insensitive to their spouses. For me, the Bleakley Chlorians manifest as hoarding. I have a coin collection, a rock collection, a stamp collection, an art collection, a family history artifacts collection, a resources for art lessons collection, and a massive book collection that Lynn would happily burn in a cathartic pyre and go and live in a minimalist white cube if she could. My other Aspergic attribute that she finds a bit more impressive is focused stamina. If I have a project on, I can work on it for hours till ridiculous o'clock and still get up for work the next day. It's not always easy to live with, of course. It gives me my focused persistence to write, edit and publish hours of content while the house and garden descends into chaos around me, and my long-suffering wife cuts me enough slack to get the job done, but then kicks my butt to snap me back into the real world when it gets out of hand. But then she is clearly quite ADHD and is slowly curing me of the autism by changing our plans for anything every 10 minutes, so I can now cope with that without batting an eyelid. The constantly unpredictable random cat herding of school teaching has taught me to do that as well. Right now, I'm watching her chainsawing a tree root out of the window, and I know she will turn it on me if I don't put in some hard labour before sundown. The two sides of a coin concept gives me hope for Pharisee Mormons. I know they are being taught to be Christians too, and they just need permission and some encouragement to turn the energy they devote into policing each other to something more kind. In the wrong setting, though, being an extreme male or on the spectrum can be a disaster. Incredibly harmful, because as religious leaders you somehow don't feel and you ignore the real lived experiences and needs of messy humans. You have less patience for them. It is far easier to reject them and who they are because of your rigid laws, and keeping everything tidy without any exceptions to your rules always takes priority, so they must come first and the people and their suffering is of lesser importance. Your job is to preserve and maintain the machine. You regard people as machines who just need programming correctly, and you can make the inconvenient parts of their humanity go away. This is basically what happened to our church. The autistic male control freak robot engineers took over and have very rarely included women and the humanity and complexity they could have brought to the mindset in the room in their deliberations, as they perverted something beautiful and good. And the men they have passed this all onto have been carefully chosen to be the least curious, the least free-thinking, the least empathetic and self-aware, the least likely to question and change anything. And therefore they don't really study the scriptures like their predecessors did anymore, and have their minds opened to the much more messy and interesting doctrines and possibilities and big ideas to be found there. They don't notice that the scriptures as a whole are much more nuanced and varied and even unfathomable than the simple certainty of the few proof texts taken out of context that they keep referencing in their boring and small religion. They don't study the church's history enough to realize that constant change, even reluctantly, is what having living prophets is meant to be about as we learn and improve. They can say the words about that, quote the scripture references, but they really don't understand it. And so it is that their talks these days are mostly quoting each other and themselves rather than anything deeper. Instead of keeping up with reality and developments in society and science regarding women and academics and LGBTQ people, and leading the way to a better and kinder and more just and truthful future, they become caricature grumpy granddads resisting change, frustrated and confused by the modern age, and fail to see all its potential. They recoil and start to become peddlers of fear and doom, hit the self-destruct button and conclude and teach that we must never change, even if it destroys everything we have worked so hard to build and begin. The end of everything is now. The entire edifice of our church, our universities, our families must be destroyed, rather than ever compromising on their rigid boundaries and unrealistic and hypocritical certainties. The church in my country, that they see as some kind of far-off libtard socialist dystopia, will just have to be sacrificed to preserve the Mormon Utah culture unchanged. After all, ours is not the promised land, it's theirs. We are all expendable. The LGBTQ kids who keep insisting on being public about their sexuality will have to be publicly shamed as a threat to civilization and expelled and excommunicated. The people telling them they are wrong with reasoned arguments and evidence must be demonized as Satan's minions, silenced and excommunicated. And they must keep doing that until there is nothing more left when Jesus actually arrives than 10 fanatical Mormons with the biggest pile of gold and investments in history to give the Messiah as a welcome back gift as he climbs up the vast mountain of the dead bones of the testimonies and children he loves more than his own life that they sacrificed in their arrogant pride and madness to get to them. For Pharisee Mormons, the important thing is that they were right and never compromised, however many people it hurt. And they honestly believe that Jesus will pat them on the head as they pass over the bank account details and call them good and faithful servants, rather than telling them he never knew them and dropping them through a cosmic trapdoor to spend a few billion years on the naughty step with Lucifer, who made all the same bad choices. But until that reality check, we continue to listen to them from their thrones and pulpits, telling people their experiences are not real, their feelings are not real, who they are is not real. Any factual information or evidence that proves their rigid framing of everything cannot be real must be a deception from Satan. And when they really cannot answer a question, or incorporate a reality or contradictory evidence disproving their boundaries and assumptions, many of them formulated and codified in the harsh semi-deserts of the Middle East in the very pre-scientific actual Bronze Age, and believe what filtered to us from those people is eternal, unchanging truth that cannot be improved upon in its opinions of LGBTQ people and women and black people. They will double down. They are so certain that those ideas are the whole truth that they will abandon integrity and lie if necessary to hide or discredit those inconvenient truths and documents and proof that everything is much more complicated than they told us it is and was. And they will break people. And if they are not opposed and challenged and stopped, eventually they will break our religion. And God will have to start all over again, like all the other times we read about in our scriptures that warn us not to do this to ourselves. This same struggle and ideological civil war has been going on from the start, and before the start, in LDS theology. It is the war between the empathetic and open-minded learners and the unrealistic, rigid control freaks, who are so certain of themselves about everything they will not have the humility to listen and learn from people unlike them and change. They don't actually trust this scary, invisible God taking us on a long journey of change and progression, and prefer to trust laws and ideas from the traditional past, which they kid themselves have been unchanging, even though they have changed and evolved a lot already before being passed on to them. They cannot cope with anything new or different. Daring hoax and the musket madness. I'm framing this in my experience and language of maleness and femaleness and autism, but whatever the language, the ideas in conflict here are the same. The pre-existent war in heaven between the control freaks who want everything tidy, everyone the same, no diversity, no risk, no freedom to be different or think for yourself, versus Christ's plan to trust us to learn and grow and change until we become like God, rather than just being empty shells that appear righteous because doing is more important than being in Lucifer's religion. It played out in the differences between Adam and Eve, as I've already described. Jesus called it the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, as he led a revolution John the Baptist started, with a radical vision of putting the people and their needs and reality first, making the defining characteristic of our religion and religiosity how we treat and sacrifice our own comforts to walk with and prioritise the most different to ourselves, the most rejected for things they cannot change, like their gender or leprosy or Samaritan race or really terrible violent personality. Not sitting in the safe fold where everyone is the same and there is peace and comfort and nothing out of the box to deal with. Where preserving traditional social order and obsessing about unimportant rules, about unimportant details, is the cure for social ills, rather than radical unconditional love and compassion. Hugh Nibley identified this conflict as a struggle between leaders and managers, and predicted every component of our current crisis precisely, including the obsession with getting incredibly rich and destroying the pioneer monuments, in his BYU commencement speech 38 years ago on the 19th of August 1983. There is still enough of the Christian Mormonism surviving in our church to give us a bit of hope. At the moment, the Pharisee Mormon faction has achieved near total control, but they cannot stamp it out entirely. The other apostles are not allowing Dallin to formally canonize the family proclamation. We can hope that the reality of how many church members that and the political crusade against LGBTQ civil rights it was written for has cost them. But Brigham Young made it impossible for them to really stop Dallin Oaks while he is still alive. There is no separation of powers anymore that normalizes other general authorities moderating or disciplining or retiring another GA who has gone rogue. There is no mechanism for the general membership to vote against any particular policy specifically. The only votes they are allowed now is to vote against a leader having their calling at all. And if you do that, your temple recommend will likely be taken from you. so the stakes and intimidation making members hesitate to use that power they still have is intense. So meanwhile, in this nail-biting standoff as we wait to see who will die first, and in his desperate hubris, Dallin Oakes has used the only other mechanisms left to him, his talks and his control over teaching manuals, to canonize the family proclamation in practice, if not in official canon. He has given several speeches in General Conference, with the word plan in the title, about the family proclamation, saying that if we expect to have eternal life, we must agree with and believe everything in it. He doesn't hold back, and declaring that it is now authorized official canonized doctrine for the Church because all the 15 apostles signed off on it when it was first published. And back that up with an article in the March 2020 Ensign called "The Lord Leads His Church Through Apostles and Prophets," doubling down on that. Of course, in that article he contradicted himself by having to admit that nothing in the Church is authoritative until the members have a common consent vote, and wrote, quote, "To become the official doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ, the individual teachings of apostles and even prophets need to be affirmed through the process of approval by other apostles and prophets. This is illustrated in the Bible in the approving action of the apostles when Peter reported his revelation to take the gospel to the Gentiles. See Acts chapter 11 verses 1 and 18. Similarly, when the dispute over the need for circumcision was brought to the apostles, Peter reminded them of the significance of the revelation he had received, and the council then approved and settled the dispute with a confirming epistle to the church, see Acts 15. Similarly, in the restored church, doctrine is not canonized until the body of the church has received it by the law of common consent, see Doctrine and Covenants 26:2 and 28:13. That principle was revealed in 1830 and has been applied since that time. This practice, which had not been followed by churches existing during the period we call the apostasy, protects gospel truths from being altered or influenced by private ideas or individual opinions." Close quote. I totally agree with you, Dallin. I sustain as the truth 2 paragraphs of a Dallin Oakes article. I bet you never thought you'd hear me say that of my nemesis. I am totally obsessed with Dallin Oakes because he really is the one-man powerhouse running the show in my church now, so that is unavoidable, but I'm not personally prejudiced against the Oakester. If he says something congruent with the actual restoration, I'll cheer him on. And he is as much a product and victim of a system he did not create as the people he harms. Although I must admit my iPhone's voice recognition algorithms do seem to be channeling something significant, as when I say Dallin Oakes, it writes daring hoax, or perhaps even funnier, Dallin Oakes. My phone seems to agree with the post-Mormon feministas who accuse nuanced and post-Mormon communities unfairly of replicating patriarchal dysfunctions and making John Dallin into a member of a post-Mormon First Presidency, along with Bill Reel and Radio Free Mormon, which rather seems to me to be ignoring our glorious female thought leaders like Lindsay Hanson-Park, Gina Colvin, Jana Reese, and arguably Peggy Fletcher-Stack, who all also get paid by their audiences for the work they do in our world, along with many other prominent female voices who are more than a match for the boys, like the At Last She Said It team, Ordain Women, and Breaking Down Patriarchy podcasters. Nuanced and post-Mormonism are doing a fantastic job modelling how a Mormon community can ordain, promote and sustain women to senior roles as equals of men, based entirely on their merits and the relevance and power of what they say, rather than as second-class citizen tokens or female microphones for male leaders' ideas, as the LDS Church tends to. Anyway, back to daring hoax. Dallin Oaks. Dallin is persistent and powerful, but that does not mean he is rational or actually makes sense. We must always remember this so we don't fear these leaders or assume they are too powerful to successfully oppose, moderate, reform, or if necessary, remove from power. When they are practicing the Pharisee Mormon religion, they immediately lose most of their power, because to teach and live that religion, they have to become clowns, constantly contradicting Jesus, contradicting each other, contradicting themselves, contradicting evidence, contradicting science, contradicting the scriptures, and contradicting reason. All they have is psychological manipulation, propaganda, institutional authority, and overconfidence. Some people fall for that, but most do not when it goes on too long, as we are now seeing as every year now far more people stop participating in the LDS Church than join it. Both Dallin Oaks and Jeffrey Holland have been the president of BYU Provo in the past, and they are teaming up now to ruin the institution they claimed to love. So here we are this week, listening to Apostle Jeffrey Holland from the same pulpit at a commencement speech at BYU, fulfilling horribly everything Hugh Nibley warned us about. He declared his intention to hold on tightly to the LGBTQ phobia of Packer and never compromise till his dying breath on making BYU a place where those depraved people are silenced and forbidden to exist, forbidden to love themselves, forbidden to have symbols and flags that other people might see and be unsettled by, where the unchanging rules in a dangerously evolving and learning world must be protected consistently with metaphorical muskets pointed at the LGBTQ people, where it is far more important to hold that line even at the cost of being cruel and regarded as failing to show and feel human empathy, and where rather than offering validation and comfort to LGBTQ students, and just enough hope and care to save them from suicide, the faculty and clergy must withdraw that essential Christian compassion and ministering care, their professional duty of care, and be robots repeating outdated and disproven dogmas from the Bronze and Iron Ages that ignore reality and science in the 21st century space age. He has a flowery speaking style that gives the illusion of emotionally literate compassion, and occasionally breaks through to being human when he has spoken of his own battles with depression. But most of the time his robotic and uncompromising Pharisee religion comes through red in tooth and claw, as it did this week, and he doesn't hesitate to attack the students he claims to love and want to protect, if they dare to step out of his bigoted lines.
Then imagine the pain that comes with a memo like this one I recently received. These are just a half a dozen lines from a 2-page document. You should know, the writer says, that some people in the extended community are feeling abandoned and betrayed at BYU, or by BYU. It seems that some professors, at least the vocal ones in the media, are supporting ideas that many of us feel are contradictory to gospel principles, making it appear to be about like any other university our sons and daughters could have attended. Several parents have said they no longer want to send their children here or donate to the school. Please don't think I'm opposed to people thinking differently about policies and ideas, the writer continues. I'm not. But I would hope that BYU professors would be bridging those gaps between faith and intellect, and would be sending out students that are ready to do the same in loving, intelligent, articulate ways. Yet I fear that some faculty are not supportive of the church's doctrines and policies and choose to criticize them publicly. There are consequences to this. After having served a full-time mission and marrying her husband in the temple, a friend of mine recently left the church. In her graduation statement on a social media post, she credited such and such a BYU program and its faculty with the radicalization of her attitudes and the destruction of her faith. Well, fortunately, we don't get too many of those letters, but this one isn't unique. Several of my colleagues get the same kind, with almost all of them ultimately being forwarded to poor President Kevin Worthen. Now, most of what happens on this campus is absolutely wonderful. That's why I began as I did. That's why I'm crying. I say it with my own undying love for this place. But every so often, we need a reminder of the challenge we constantly face here. I said then, and I say now, that if we're an extension of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and take a significant amount of sacred tithes and other human precious resources, all of which might well be expended in other worthy causes, surely our integrity demands that our lives be absolutely consistent with and characteristic of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. At a university, there will always be a healthy debate regarding a whole syllabus full of issues. But until we all come to the unity of the faith and have grown to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, our next best achievement will be to stay in harmony with the Lord's anointed, those whom He has designated to declare church doctrine and to guide Brigham Young University as its trustees. In 2014, 7 years ago, then Elder Russell M. Nelson came to campus in this same setting. His remarks were relatively brief, but tellingly he said, "With the church growing more rapidly in the less prosperous countries, we must conserve sacred funds more carefully than ever before. At BYU, we must ally ourselves even more closely with the work of our Heavenly Father. A college education per se for our people is a sacred responsibility, but it's not essential for eternal life." A statement like that gets my attention, particularly because just a short time later, President Nelson chairs our board, holds our purse strings, and has the final yay or nay on every proposal we make, from a research lab to more undergraduate study space to approving a new pickup for the physical facilities staff. Russell M. Nelson is very, very good to listen. He is very good to listen to us. We who sit with him every day have learned the value of listening carefully to him. 3 years later, 2017, Elder Dallin H. Oaks, not then, but soon to be in the First Presidency, he would be sitting where only one chair, one heartbeat away from the same position President Nelson now has. He quoted our colleague, Elder Neil A. Maxwell, who had said, and I quote, "In a way, Latter-day Saint scholars at BYU and elsewhere are a little bit like the builders of the temple in Nauvoo, who worked with a trowel in one hand and a musket in the other. Today, scholars building the temple of learning must also pause on occasion to defend the kingdom. I personally think," Elder Maxwell went on to say, "this is one of the reasons the Lord established and maintains this university. The dual role of builder and defender is unique and ongoing. I'm grateful we have scholars today who can handle, as it were, both trowel and musket." Then Elder Oaks said challengingly, "I'd like to hear a little more musket fire from the Temple of Learning." He said this in a way that could have applied to a host of topics in various departments, but the one he specifically mentioned was the doctrine of the family and defending marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Little did he know that while many would hear his appeal, especially the School of Family Life, who moved quickly and visibly to assist, some others fired their muskets all right, but unfortunately didn't always aim at those hostile to the church. We thought a couple of stray rounds even went north of the point of the mountain. My beloved brothers and sisters, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And I'll go to my grave pleading that this institution not only stands, but stands unquestionably committed to its unique academic mission and the church that sponsors it. We hope it isn't a surprise to you that your trustees are not deaf or blind to the feelings that swirl around marriage and the whole same-sex topic on campus and a lot of other topics. I and many of my brethren have spent more time and shed more tears on this subject than we could ever adequately convey to you this morning or any morning. We have spent hours discussing what the doctrine of the church can and cannot provide the individuals and families struggling over this difficult issue. So it's with a little scar tissue of our own that we are trying to avoid, and hope all will try to avoid, language and symbols and situations that are more divisive than unifying at the time we want to show love for all of God's children. If a student commandeers a graduation podium intended to represent everyone getting diplomas that day, in order to announce his personal sexual orientation, what might another speaker feel free to announce the next year until eventually anything goes? What might commencement come to mean or not mean if we push individual license over institutional dignity for very long? Do we simply end up with more divisiveness in our culture than we already have, and we already have far too much everywhere? In that spirit, let me go no farther before declaring unequivocally my love and that of my brethren for those who live with this same-sex challenge and so much complexity that goes with it. Too often, the world has been unkind, in many instances crushingly cruel, to these, our brothers and sisters. Like many of you, we have spent hours with them. We have wept and prayed and wept again in an effort to offer love and hope, while keeping the gospel strong and obedience to commandments evident in every individual life. But it will assist all of us. It will assist everyone trying to provide help in this matter if things can be kept in some proportion and balance in the process. For example, we have to be careful that love and empathy do not get interpreted as condoning and advocacy, or that orthodoxy and loyalty to principle not be interpreted as unkindness or disloyalty to people. As near as I can tell, Christ never once withheld his love from anyone. But he also never once said to anyone, "Because I love you, you are exempt from keeping my commandments." We're tasked with trying to strike that same sensitive, demanding balance in our lives. Musket fire. Yes, we will always need defenders of the faith. But friendly fire is a tragedy. And from time to time, the church, its leaders, and some of our colleagues within the university community have taken such fire on this campus. and sometimes it isn't friendly. Wounding students and the parents of students, so many who are confused about what so much recent flag waving and parade holding on this issue means. My beloved friends, this kind of confusion and conflict ought not to be, not here. There are better ways to move toward crucially important goals in these very difficult matters, ways that show empathy and understanding for everyone while maintaining loyalty to prophetic leadership and devotion to revealed doctrine. My brethren have made the case for the metaphor of musket fire, which I have endorsed yet again today. There will continue to be those who oppose our teachings, and that will continue the need to define, document, and defend the faith. But we all look forward to the day when we can beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. And at least on this subject, learn war no more. And while I have focused on this same sex topic this morning more than I would have liked, I pray that you'll see it as emblematic of a lot of issues our students and our community, our church, faces in this complex contemporary world of ours. But I digress. Back to the blessings of a school in Zion. Do you see the beautiful parallel between the unfolding of the restoration and the prophetic development of BYU, notwithstanding that both will have their critics along the way? Like the church itself, BYU has grown in spiritual strength, in the number of people it reaches and serves, and in its unique place among other institutions of higher education. It seems clear to me in my 73 years of loving it that BYU will become an educational Mount Everest only to the degree it embraces its uniqueness, its singularity. We could mimic every other university in this world until we get a bloody nose in the effort. And that world would still say, BYU who? No, we must have the will to be different, to stand alone if necessary, being a university second to none in its role primarily as an undergraduate teaching institution that is unequivocally true to the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. If at a future time that mission means foregoing some professional affiliations and certifications, then so be it. There may come a day when the price we are asked to pay for such association is simply too high, too inconsistent with who we are. No one wants it to come to that, least of all me. But if it does, we will pursue our own destiny. A destiny that is not a matter of chance, but largely a matter of choice. A destiny not a thing to be waited for, but a thing to be envisioned and achieved.
He quoted homophobes writing to him about feeling, quote, abandoned and betrayed, close quote, because they hear some BYU students and faculty advocating for treating LGBTQ people as equals, or experience the trauma of witnessing some people waving rainbow flags. And because they are the proverbial TBMs, their discomfort clearly counts for far more with Jeffrey Holland and his colleagues than the young lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer Latter-day Saints, who are also students and faculty at BYU, who are told repeatedly by these apostles that they don't exist, that they are fundamentally broken, that they are dangerous, that they are choosing a deviant lifestyle that is offensive to God, that their existence is an existential threat to everyone else's families, and that if they are tolerated, it will lead to the actual destruction and end of civilization. They endure church leaders repeatedly offering them hope and apparent understanding and empathy, then being ruthlessly stabbed in the back by them, over and over again. That is what really being, quote, abandoned and betrayed, close quote, involves. Not being unsettled a bit because some less prejudiced and ignorant fellow Mormons express opinions about tolerance you don't agree with. Watch the apostles scurry to placate them, while taking zero responsibility whatsoever for the young people who trusted them as mouthpieces of Jesus, who they drove to suicide, and their grieving families and friends. Don't fall for these endless crocodile tears of Jeffrey Holland or President Nelson claiming to care deeply and agonize about LGBTQ people. Actions speak louder than words, and these people have failed in their actions the most basic possible test of being a Christian or a Mormon Christian. Jesus taught his real apostles, quote, "Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 19:14. And in Matthew 18 verse 6, quote, "Whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." Close quote. The Restoration Article of Faith number 2 says, "We believe that men will be punished for their own sins, and not for Adam's transgression." And number 11 says, "We claim the privilege of worshipping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men, which includes children, the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may." But these people, claiming to be apostles of the same Jesus and guardians of the Restoration, decided that it was completely acceptable to forbid children and teenagers their religious freedom, to believe and participate and be baptized in our religion, and to ostracize and discriminate against them if they had a parent who had ever cohabited in a same-sex relationship, not just currently cohabiting. Remember the original wording of what Russell Nelson declared to be a revelation they all discussed at length and agreed on was so ineptly or intentionally ruthlessly worded that it erased the atonement and punished these children for something their parents was doing or even had done in the past and now stopped doing. One of the conditions listed in the policy for being allowed to be baptized as an adult was, quote, "The child is of legal age and does not live with a parent who has lived or currently lives in a same-gender cohabitation relationship or marriage." Close quote. Has lived, past tense. You just couldn't make up this level of shambolic incompetence or ruthless fanatical cruelty. They literally forbade little children to come to Jesus. Even babies were forbidden to be blessed. And still these men expect us to take them seriously and give them the benefit of the doubt about the tangled webs of irrational reasoning and mental gymnastics they expect us to be fooled by when they can't even get the most basics right and take no responsibility for that, never apologizing for the harm they do. 3 years after Russell Nelson doubled down on it, they pretended to abandon the November policy. Dallin Oaks announced at a leadership training session of April 2019 General Conference that, quote, previously, our handbook characterised same-gender marriage by a member as apostasy. While we consider such a marriage to be a serious transgression, it will not be treated as apostasy for the purposes of church discipline. Instead, the immoral conduct in heterosexual or homosexual relationships will be treated in the same way, close quote. But actions speak louder than words. Stakes all over the world are now busy again, excommunicating same-sex couples who love the church despite all its best efforts to alienate them and attend regularly for getting married, while ignoring countless heterosexual members who are promiscuous or living together and haven't married, including those who don't attend or believe in this church anymore at all. And their short-lived tolerance of celibate same-sex dating and holding hands reversal at BYU also showed they don't really mean their claim to be treating heterosexual and homosexual people the same now. Invalidating the valedictorians. I first witnessed Jeffrey Holland publicly bullying teenagers and young adults when I was 18 and had just arrived in the Florida Tallahassee mission. My first zone conference was quite epic, with the whole mission gathered together to hear from a very special guest who was visiting the mission, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland of the First Quorum of 70. Growing up in Britain, I'd only ever been in the same room as a handful of general authorities in my life, in the rare conferences that had one visiting, so this was very exciting. In his usual over-the-top style, he started addressing from the pulpit the assembled cohort of incredible retired couples and young people barely out of their teens, faithfully devoting an entire 2 years if they had a willy, or 18 months if they had boobies, to taking Mormonism to the Bible Belt, and loving and serving complete strangers with overalls, guns, and Mississippi-burning accents, just because they were all worth it to Jesus. Still feeling warm and fuzzy from the experience of the Missionary Training Center, learning and Mormonizing with literally thousands of Latter-day Saints my age, after a lifetime living where Mormons are rare as hen's teeth, and somewhat bewildered by the fundamental weirdness that is the USA in general, and specifically the magical and surreal Deep South, I was on tenterhooks to hear what he would say. Oh dear. Apparently, in his opinion, our mission was crap. So he berated everyone for being crap. He didn't just say, "You're all crap," because he's into more elaborate, preferably militaristic metaphors. So the way he told us we were all crap was to say that if this was a war, he wouldn't trust us to go into battle with him as his fellow soldiers. One of the other new crop of missionaries leaned over and whispered to me that if we snuck out quietly now, maybe we could make a getaway before they realised we'd even arrived in this apparently really crap mission, and we could go somewhere else. Jeffers really wasn't selling it to us. Then he called our poor district and zone leaders up to the front to write their monthly numerical targets for discussions and baptisms on a board, including, if I remember right, one of my adorable MTC district members who had been promoted to district leader really quickly. Then Elder Holland berated them for not being faithful and ambitious enough and bullied them to basically double all the targets, which of course hardly anyone, if anyone, actually met in the following month, because the original goals were already unrealistically ambitious. So I've known for many decades that Jeffrey Holland is a bullying arsehole. As I always say to the missionaries navigating their confusing experience of the best and absolute worst of Mormonism on their missions, some of the most important life-changing lessons to learn from a mission are how not to motivate and lead people. And if you learn those lessons well, you will be a wonderful leader yourself for the rest of your life by carefully avoiding what those arseholes did. There is a beautiful epilogue to this story. Holland the Impaler was accompanied in this tour de farce by another... Holland the Impaler was accompanied on his tour de farce by another minor general authority of some kind, whose name I would love to find out but can't remember. He was obviously a good guy who hadn't sold his soul to his own ego, and when he visited the mission again a year or so later, in his own right, he specifically did what he could to undo the damage he had witnessed being done to us by the bullying Pharisee. This adorable Christian Mormon man humbly thanked us for our selfless service, told us we were special and doing a great job, and that he would be proud to go into battle with us. I've been trying my best to always fight on his side of the Mormon Civil War ever since. The real gospel and real leadership is about love, appreciating the sacrifices of a volunteer workforce, and teaching young people the goodness and hope of their great potential, rather than guilt-tripping and shaming them. So while a lot of church members who have for years regarded Jeffrey Holland as the positive future of the church, who has seemed to be empathetic and vulnerable in his talks, have been processing extreme disappointment in his negativity, hardline homophobia, and shamelessly shaming a young man who didn't do what he accused him of, or deserved to be turned into a cipher of sinfulness, I wasn't at all surprised. That's who Jeffrey Holland really is, and that's how he treats LDS young people, just trying to fill the world with love instead of his judgmental and psychologically fragile hatreds, and habitual lies. Bill Reel was basically excommunicated for daring to publicly identify some of the lies Holland has told, and calling him liar, liar, pants on fire. That was long before his lie to the young people of Europe and Africa that he is, and always has been, poor. I'm all for righteous anger. It's one of my favourite things. Anger is an energy that brings about necessary change, as my wise mother taught me. But I direct it at the people with the power they are abusing, like him, not the vulnerable and the young, like the Pharisee Mormon leaders do. In this talk, he threw under the bus Matt Easton, a wonderful young student who gave a valedictorian speech approved by his dean, in which, like all valedictorian speakers, he celebrated everyone's achievements and shared some of his own journey, including accepting himself as a gay son of God. One of the silver linings to come out of this homophobic cloud for me is that for the first time I listened to the whole of Matt Easton's heartwarming and hopeful speech. If sanity ever comes to my church in large enough doses to save it, Matt will be one of the apostles, and this is the kind of thing we can look forward to in General Conference.
I would like to begin by saying congratulations. Congratulations to each of you for making it here, for pushing through an incredibly difficult, rigorous, and impressive degree at BYU. Congratulations to those who seriously consider dropping out, but who stuck with it. Congratulations to those who tackled the challenge of bearing and raising a child while studying. Congrats to those who were insane enough to get married mid-semester and still somehow survive. And congrats to those of us who are still single and who have made it through 4 years of jokes about when are we going to get married. Congratulations to those who at some point felt alone or afraid or uncertain while here. To those of us who have struggled with our faith, and to those who have strengthened it. Congratulations to my siblings of color, my LGBTQ friends. That's right. To students who are walking with mental illness. To all those who constantly have stood in the face of adversity to make our campus better for future generations. You are seen, you are loved, and today you are here to celebrate. In the course of our time at BYU, we have witnessed historic events among these hallowed halls, well worth celebrating. We have seen new buildings rise up, bold policies change, a shift to 2-hour church, and my personal favorite, the introduction of fully caffeinated Coca-Cola in the will. I'm sure that among each of these moments, you and your friends share your own memories that you are celebrating today and will cherish forever. For me, I'm here to celebrate a few of my own personal victories. The first happened my freshman year. It was a warm September morning, and I was walking to my class when I felt a mysterious person pull me to the ground and knock the wind right out of me. Perplexed at who would do kind of a rude thing, I looked up to see not a student running away, but a deer. Yes, I was actually hit by a deer. It wasn't long before this was on the campus Snapchat story, and I affectionately became known as the Deer Boy. Resulting from this incident was a popular Universe article, a few memes, and even a hernia surgery. Yes, the deer quite really knocked the guts out of me. Today, I would like to tell that deer that it did not get the best of me. I'm still here, and I'm still hungry for venison. Now, my second victory is not mine alone, but that of my family, and especially my mother. 3 years ago, I was on campus when I received a call that would forever change my life. My parents informed me that my mom had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I had no idea how quickly a world could turn upside down, how instantaneously my perspective could change. I learned better how to cherish and who to cherish. Now, I am proud to say that my mom is here in this audience today. We don't know what awaits us or her, but we are learning to celebrate the time we do have left. It is a daily victory to have my mom here to remember what really matters. In the Book of Mormon, Enos is described as having his soul hunger, of crying out to the Lord in mighty prayer and supplication. As I'm sure many of you have felt, I recall countless times here at the Y where I have battled and fought in prayer with my Maker. It was in these quiet moments of pain and confusion that I felt another triumph. That of coming to terms not with who I thought I should be, but who the Lord has made me to be. As such, I stand before my family, friends, and graduating class today to say that I am proud to be a gay son of God. I am not broken. I am loved and important to the plan of our great Creator. Each of us are. Thank you to my parents, to my friends, and my mentors here at BYU, who have offered support and helped me remember my divine potential here on this earth. 4 years ago, it would have been impossible for me to imagine that I would come out in my entire college. It is a phenomenal feeling, and it is a victory for me in and of itself. Perhaps there are those of you here today who are afraid or uncertain about how to deal with the unique challenges that you face. I hope that my stories can serve as a reminder that BYU has given us the foundation to face difficult problems, both secular and spiritual, and that with the Lord, all things are possible. As I conclude here today, I ask you all to consider, what are you here to celebrate? What are your victories the world needs to know? I can promise that your story is important and your place in this world invaluable. Remember this. As I look around the Marriott Center, I am overwhelmed by the sense of greatness that each of you exude. Among us are future doctors, lawyers, teachers and leaders, mothers and fathers and dreamers and doers, people who will change the world. Perhaps, even more importantly, are the people who will change each other and the people who will change themselves. The atonement of Jesus Christ is perfect and everlasting. And through our Savior, we too can become perfect. No matter our trials, no matter our triumphs, we are here today to become the better version of ourselves. And as we leave our campus for the last time today, may we continue on our path to victory. And ultimately, we will succeed. Behold, this is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. What could be better to celebrate? Thank you.
I remember the hope for change for BYU and Mormonism that his speech inspired at the time. followed as it was in February 2020 by the BYU leadership announcing that they would take seriously the repeal of the November policy and the stated intention of the church's leaders to judge homosexual Latter-day Saints in regard to chastity on exactly the same basis as heterosexuals, except for the marrying thing, of course. Since heterosexual students were allowed public displays of affection, like holding hands or kissing each other without being married, so would LGBTQ students, without it being considered a violation of the Honour Code, for which you would get put on probation or expelled. They quietly removed from the Honour Code the stipulation banning, quote, all forms of physical intimacy that give expression to homosexual feelings. CNN interviewed one of the lesbian students who said, I feel free and cared for by the university for the first time in a long time. I really hope they don't disappoint me again. And a spokesperson for the university told CNN, we want our LGBTQ students to feel welcome and included on our campus. The student was right to be cautious. After a few days of rejoicing and lots more LGBTQ BYU students coming out of the closet, there was an immediate backlash by the horrified homophobes, and within a couple of weeks the church leadership forced a rapid U-turn. Paul V. Johnson, Commissioner of the Church Education System, released a statement that, quote, same-sex romantic behaviour cannot lead to eternal marriage, and is therefore not compatible with the principles included in the Honour Code, close quote. Once again, the LDS leadership had dangled hope and then betrayed LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and their families and allies by taking one step forward and 3 steps back in their ongoing psychodrama mental torture chamber. Holland's talk this week was just the next nail in the coffin of hope he and his regime are hammering in, like the Romans hammering nails into Christ's hands and feet. Remember, Jesus was always crystal clear. If we do something to the least of his brothers and sisters, it is as if we are doing it to him. So you'd better make sure you are not crucifying people who don't deserve it, or he will be taking it very personally, especially if you claim to be doing that in his name. It's time to speak in a time of war. My stake president, in excommunicating me, insisted that I am bringing and initiating war. So this talk, telling the BYU staff to aim muskets at LGBTQ people and critics of the church, has been perfectly timed to remind everyone that Lucifer started this war, and in the temple endowment he says he got the idea from what the other Lucifers have done before in other worlds. And then the equivalents of the Pharisees in every age since have brought the war to the Christians, opposing truth with their lies, opposing integrity and being honest in all our dealings with their manipulations and conspiracies to withhold information, hide truth with their lies and deceive people, and opposing the free agency of the people with their dictatorship and abuses of power, as they take it all to themselves from God and from us, and then rule with what Doctrine and Covenants eloquently calls unrighteous dominion. In his March 2020 Ensign article, Dallin Oakes wrote, quote, finally, the essential unity on doctrine among different leaders is preserved by the long-standing rule that questions addressed to individual apostles or other authorities about doctrine or policy that is not clearly defined in the scriptures or handbooks are to be referred to the First Presidency. See Doctrine and Covenants 124, 126, close quote. This brings me nicely to my excommunication appeal letter. There are very few scenarios where the First Presidency are actually obliged to read or respond to questions and criticisms by ordinary church members. Usually, such inquiries are sent straight back down the line to their stake president to deal with, usually with no advice at all about what to do with them. One of the few situations where they are meant to deal with it themselves is when somebody appeals to them to overturn a decision to excommunicate them by a stake president. And I definitely have some specific questions about doctrine and policy to ask them, since my stake president has been unable or unwilling to answer them. So this is my chance! What would you want to put in a letter to the First Presidency if you knew they had to read it? This is very exciting. Now, I'm sure it is highly unlikely that any of them will actually read my letter. Some lower-level bureaucrats will be dealing with it, and the First Presidency will most likely sign off on whatever they recommend. But you never know. Whoever does read it, I determined to make sure they will have an interesting time and get taken on a mind-expanding journey. As I've said before, I'm usually very focused on objective analysis of evidence and events in my podcast, rather than claiming to be a unique prophetic voice, or inspired by God in what I do and say. Goodness knows our Mormon world is overcluttered enough with people demanding respect or trust because of claiming to have had a revelation or divine inspiration, and convincing people to believe them by manipulating their emotions or cross-referencing with miracles and coincidences to give themselves credibility. I've been at pains to emphasize throughout, what I am saying and campaigning for is not my own invention. I'm trying to organize and present the collective analysis and wisdom of thousands of people it has been my privilege to encounter and learn from, and have life-changing discussions with in the nuanced and post-Mormon communities. To appreciate and pass on their brilliant ideas as well as their feelings and pain. The two things I suppose that I am adding to the recipe, which listeners have been very kind to compliment, is that my overall purpose is to serve both communities, and that I organise information and events into larger pictures that make some sense of really confusing and overwhelming information overloads, and help people to see how they all interconnect, and how, if necessary, we can use those maps to navigate through complex social systems of belief and power to act and be acted upon, or to infiltrate and remove a dangerous aristocracy and liberate our people within their own fortress and take back our own land, our own church, rather than having to become refugees and build a new church from scratch somewhere else. I'm trying to serve the needs of active Latter-day Saints by celebrating and uplifting the best and most healthy, mind-expanding and encouraging ideas in Mormonism's theology and cultural strengths as a strictly realistic blueprint for a healthier future for the religion I believe and love, despite several of its leaders' best efforts to make it unbelievable and unlovable, and to serve the needs of a much larger community, the vast majority of Latter-day Saints who have left the church voluntarily or been driven out of it. I want to address their lived past, present and future. I want to reassure them that they were not stupid to have been attracted to this religion and loved and been thrilled by its better people and its better ideas in the past. I want them to know that in the present there are members of the church fighting hard to make the church stop teaching and doing the things that hurt them. I want them to have a future where they know their sacrifices and pain as victims and at times deceived perpetrators of the church's dysfunctions have been seen, understood, apologized for, and learnt from. That some good came from the bad because we reformed the church and made it a safer place for their dear friends and family members who are still actively participating in it to be, and that the church will stop telling those friends and family members to judge and fear and hate them. Both groups, The Mormons who are active and want their children to stay in the religion, and the Mormons who left have a common enemy. The leaders who lie and keep using their rhetoric and exercise of power to drive vulnerable groups of people out of the church instead of welcoming them in and making it safe for them to return to, like Jesus taught. It really is that simple. It really is a civil war. As we are seeing in the heartbreaking ongoing disaster in Afghanistan's civil war that has in turn broken the might of the last three global superpowers, the British Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now this week the USA, who all got involved and tried to sort that mess out and bring peace, or their version of modern civilization, and all had to withdraw defeated. To fight a war as messy and confusing as a civil war, you need to have a very clear strategy. You have to know as clearly as possible what your end game is. You need to be sure you have the resources and weaponry to win. You have to have a deep understanding of how your enemy thinks. And you have to spend far more time winning people's hearts and minds than you spend just attacking your enemies. In a civil war, many of your opponents are your dearest friends, your own parents or siblings or children. Jesus taught, in his more philosophical intervals between being in attack mode, ranting and swearing in the streets at the Pharisees and flipping tables in the Sadducees' temple, that joining his religion is joining a civil war that can get that messy and personal and brutal. He didn't sugarcoat the sacrifices involved. As the New Living Translation of Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 56 puts it, he said, quote, "I have come to set the world on fire, and I wish it were already burning. I have a terrible baptism of suffering ahead of me, and I am under a heavy burden until it is accomplished. Do you think I have come to bring peace to the earth? No. I have come to divide people against each other. From now on, families will be split apart, 3 in favour of me and 2 against, or 2 in favour and 3 against. Father will be divided against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, and mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law." Then Jesus turned to the crowd and said, "When you see clouds beginning to form in the west, you say, 'Here comes a shower,' and you are right. When the south wind blows, you say, 'Today will be a scorcher,' and it is. You fools! You know how to interpret the weather signs of the earth and sky, but you don't know how to interpret the present times." Close quote. My lovely stake president and his councillors, and far too many of the Latter-day Saints, have believed the Pharisee lie that the only way to be Christ-like is to be calm, peaceful, conciliatory, endlessly tolerant and patient when leaders screw up, and so on. He said so in our conversations, and I challenged him to remember that Jesus was a revolutionary. He said so in my apostasy trial, and I challenged him to remember that Jesus was a revolutionary. He said so in his letter you're about to hear, explaining his judgment to excommunicate me, and in my email replying to him, I challenged him to remember that Jesus was a revolutionary. It really is like banging your head against a brick wall over and over again. But that wall is crumbling now in the church because truth prevails. It is fundamentally weakened, and if we just persist blowing our horns and making a noise and keep marching, it will fall like the walls of Jericho. The fluffy peacemaking statements of Jesus and the prophets are only half the story. This is the same God who got so pissed off with everyone he killed almost the entire human and animal population of the world in a flood, and is planning to do the same with a fire one day. who condoned ruthless genocide repeatedly in the Old Testament, who beat money changers with a whip. As Ecclesiastes 3 teaches, quote, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace." Close quote. This idea that the only Christ-like way is quiet, non-confrontational, gentle, never upsetting, and always reassuring is the passive-aggressive cult control technique the Pharisee Mormons seem to love the most. They have trained everyone to be stupid by telling them that as soon as they hear something that challenges their comfort zones, that makes them experience cognitive dissonance, must be, by definition, satanic, and the people saying those things satanic, and thus they train them to stop progressing and learning anything useful that is new. Intellectually, that is the most effective strategy possible to end learning, to end education, to stop eternal progression in its tracks. So, of course, Lucifer loves it, and the leaders of Lucifer's religion have made this one of their prime directives. And if it seems the sheeple are still wriggling free of that thought-stopping behaviour and choosing to listen to people telling them things that are uncomfortable to hear, or challenging their assumptions, and introducing them to bigger and truer and deeper truths about things like sexuality and gender identity, or real Mormon history, the apostles panic about a revolution overthrowing them and their tenuous regime illegally concentrating far too much power to themselves without a vote of the people. They send in the big guns like Elder Holland to tell those teachers and students and clergy and whoever to pack it in and go back to not questioning or testing their truth claims. They tell them to just believe and trust the leaders completely, to concentrate on making propaganda promoting those leaders, to stop having the conversations, waving the flags, or comforting the suicidal and self-loathing children in their congregation or campus that challenge people to realise they don't yet know everything and still have a lot more to learn about truth and love. Whether you call it coincidence or divinely sanctioned destiny, seeing connections between things and explaining them to people in ways they would not otherwise understand is one of the gifts I was given in my amazing patriarchal blessing. I got lucky with having one of the state patriarchs who was a real prophet, as far as I can tell, so I have one of the super awesome patriarchal blessings that was genuinely prophetic, personal, and has all been fulfilled. I realise a lot of patriarchal blessings are generic or wildly inaccurate duds. It is too much to ask of old men to suddenly switch on the gift of prophecy like clockwork every weekend in ways the actual prophets don't come close to matching. Just because someone put their hands on their head and pronounced them to be prophets, as has been more than obvious in the many unprophesying prophets appointed by themselves in secret to rule the LDS Church. We often talk about the harm the Church does to young people, but we should remember that it has institutionalized some really cruel elder abuse as well. But sometimes the ordained stake patriarchs really have been blessed with the spiritual gift of prophecy and revelation too. And my lovely patriarch pulled off a poetic blinder when he pressed record on the tape recorder and put his hands on my 17-year-old head and started speaking to me the words of heavenly parents who knew me inside out and had a great sense of humour, like real gods do, and Pharisees don't. Quote, "I bless you that your minds shall be one that will delight in good knowledge. You shall seek out wise and effective teachers, and by giving heed to what they impart prayerfully, you shall become truly an educated person, civilized in the best sense of that term. I bless you that you shall build spiritually and practically lasting frameworks, which may not always be obvious in a worldly sense, but nevertheless you shall recognize the importance of combining relationships and ideas, as well as the fitting together of material things. I bless you with the ability to read things which to others are difficult, the meaning of things, which shall unravel puzzling and daunting problems, shall you see with ease, advancing the work of the Lord thereby. I bless you with a joyful heart, that you shall bring balance and true relaxation into your life and the lives of others, with a merry quip and a happy thought, so that all things be not solemn and dark. Seek then for good and wholesome colour in life, for the gospel is not a grey and forbidding thing when taken in the round. Know this also, that your heavenly parents rejoice over you. Sometimes they are anxious, and indeed they chuckle on occasion. And when you meet them again, you shall realize once more that they are living and vibrant beings with all the wonderful attributes for which one could wish." Close quote. One of my favourite musicals is Finian's Rainbow. It is a very odd story about an Irishman and his daughter who have crossed the Atlantic to the racist deep south to bury a pot of leprechaun gold he found at the end of a rainbow near Fort Knox, where the American gold reserves are buried, and make lots more money, in the hope that this would exponentially magically grow his stolen gold. They find themselves in a community of poor black and white sharecroppers, constantly harassed by white racist landlords. The daughter's love interest and his black scientist friend make everyone rich by genetically engineering mentholated tobacco, by crossbreeding it with mint. Completely bonkers, isn't it? But it has some of the best songs in musical theatre. I grew up listening to the album of Finian's Rainbow my Irish dad owned, and learned all of the songs off by heart, many years before I actually saw an amateur stage production of it, and then finally the film with Petula Clark and Fred Astaire. But weirdly, magically, poetically, it foreshadowed bits of my life. My dad going to America from Ireland as a BYU student to follow his dreams, and finding my English mother there. Then my mission to the still very deeply racially segregated Deep South, still processing the legacy of sharecropping. I found myself tracting the old rickety sharecropper shacks with their elderly black descendants sitting on the porch chewing tobacco, and automatically addressing the white teenagers, offering them a Book of Mormon and a change of denomination as, "Yes, sir." And now, of course, discovering that my whole religion was built on a dreamer with a very magical worldview, who negotiated taking a buried gold treasure from its supernatural spiritual guardian, and whose descendants are now obsessed with burying stolen tithing gold in the American stock market to make it grow exponentially, while missing the things that really matter in life. Also obsessed with tobacco, and desperately needing to look to the rainbows instead of looking away from them. I got the Finian's Rainbow of patriarchal blessings, a joyful invitation to be part of and love the Christian Mormon religion. In the key song in the musical, Sharon sings her gratitude to the legacy of a dream of something better her sometimes frustrating visionary man father gave her in a song the Tabernacle Choir has performed called Look to the Rainbow. Am I going to sing it? Oh yeah, brace yourselves. On the day I was born, said my father, said he, I've an elegant legacy waitin' for ye. 'Tis a rhyme for your lips and a song for your heart, to sing it whenever the world falls apart. Look, look, look to the rainbow, follow it over the hill and stream. Look, look, look to the rainbow, follow the fellow who follows a dream. 'Twas a sumptuous gift to bequeath to a child. Oh, the lore of that song keeps me head running wild. 'Tis a rhyme for me lip and a song for me heart, and I sing it whenever the world falls apart. Look, look, look to the rainbow, follow it over the hill and stream. Look, look, look to the rainbow, follow the fellow who follows a dream. Oh, I'm sorry, everyone. I love following the dream Joseph Smith and all the greatest Mormons have had in their moments of true vision and inspiration. My patriarchal blessing was a sumptuous gift to bequeath to a child, and as I reread it now, I realise how beautifully it taught my real religion to me, just as my parents had. My patriarch John Kitzel always had a twinkle in his eye and a cheerful heart. He understood what real Mormon Christianity is about, and I love having his equally encouraging and kind-hearted son as my bishop. It is a religion where God is not an abstract, unfathomable concept or an angry judge on a throne, but real, human, loving parents who worry about you, but also are laughing along with you and probably at you sometimes, as you muddle through the crazy situations we find ourselves in during our turn on earth, who have all the wonderful attributes of a well-rounded person, not the limited, pious, self-righteous attributes of a judgmental Pharisee. It is a religion where a fundamental component of life is to learn everything you can from every wise teacher you can find, whoever they are. A religion where this is the foundation of a Zion civilization, not telling people to only believe some thin gruel being spoon-fed to adults as if they are children by people who mostly do not know what they are talking about and have a tenuous grasp of reality and what really matters to Jesus, or anyone with a bit of real compassion and empathy. My patriarchal blessing reminds me that true religion is a rainbow of colour and joy and fun, not humorless, not, quote, grey and forbidding, close quote, or, quote, solemn and dark, close quote, taking itself far too seriously. This is another part of why I still have high hopes for what Mormonism could be if it frees itself from the tightening, asphyxiating grasp of Lucifer's pompous control freaks. Apostle David Bednar is notorious for being completely obsessed with all the Pharisee things that Jesus forbade. He has repeatedly preached that your outward appearance and grooming and clothing is a key indicator of your inward spirituality and worth. Entire congregations have witnessed him lose his temper over petty things, in some cases rushing to the pulpit to withdraw an apostolic blessing he just gave to a congregation because someone dared to stand up before he did at the end of the meeting. He doesn't hesitate to bully people and arrogantly ignore or change a question he has been asked after inviting questions to something he approves of and feels is more fitting to his apostolic dignity and importance, or just what he'd rather be pontificating about that day. The internet has several examples of footage of him humiliating distressed people, or preaching about how apostles are so important and holy we must imitate them in every way, not just when they are on duty and claiming to speak for God. He is the control freak's control freak, describing in one talk how when the time came for his son to be interviewed by his stake president to determine his readiness and worthiness to serve a mission, he inserted himself into the process, meeting first with the stake president and informing him that he had been carefully raising and monitoring his son and knew for a certainty that he was completely worthy. The poor kid. Can you imagine being him and needing to reveal or confess something Daddy doesn't know about to the stake president after that? One of the many reasons we need to get on with bringing back common consent democracy and ending the dictatorship of the 15 apostles now, rather than hoping for future church leaders to be more inclusive and humane, is that because of his comparatively young age, in the not-too-distant future, David Bednar is likely to be the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for about 10 years. If it somehow survives a Dallin Oaks presidency, there is no way the church will survive that. We must stop holding the destiny of an entire religion that is meant to be all about democracy and freedom to ransom, based on the whims and personality defects of the old man who refuses to die for the longest. A couple of weeks ago, on the 30th of August 2021, David Bednar laid all his Pharisee cards on the table, as clearly as it is possible to, in a speech he gave at the Missionary Training Centre. He taught that the power of godliness pretty much entirely comes from priesthood authority and rituals, whereas Jesus and Doctrine and Covenants 121 are clear that godly power can only distill upon us when we patiently love people unconditionally, that the only real authority is gentle persuasion with pure truth, and that it is withdrawn and evaporates as soon as people expect to be respected or believed or obeyed because of their ordained priesthood leadership status. It was a stark and crystal clear example of what his religion is, and how contrary it is to Christian Mormonism. The Church News reported that, quote, Elder Bednar encouraged missionaries to strive to obtain the power of godliness through regular participation in sacred ordinances. God sets the terms and conditions of covenants and provides ordinances to help remind us of the promises made and blessings assured by obedience to those covenants, Elder Bednar said. Quote, ordinances are not simply routine rituals, they are not just perfunctory performances, he said. Through those sacred ordinances, we can be blessed with access to the power of godliness in our lives. In addition to correctly understanding the importance of ordinances, Elder Bednar also taught about the true power that comes from keeping the promises made in each covenant. Quote, in the restored Church of Jesus Christ, priesthood authority has been restored, he said. Sacred covenants and priesthood ordinances, properly administered with the authority of God, open heavenly portals so that each one of us can receive strength beyond our own. If sacred covenants and priesthood ordinances, properly administered with the authority of God, open heavenly portals, I'm really looking forward to hearing the First Presidency's answer to one of my 3 questions, which inquires why it is that our allegedly crucial priesthood key-holding First Presidencies appoint and ordain themselves in secret, with no common consent vote of the people to authorise that ordination before it happens, like we do for everyone else's callings and ordinations, when Doctrine and Covenants 2065 says, quote, "No person is to be ordained to any office in this church where there is a regularly organised branch of the same without the vote of that church." Close quote. Just as Gordon B. Hinckley did not do the church any favours by declaring that if the first vision did not happen exactly as described in the canonised account of it, which we now know is contradicted by earlier accounts and may not have even happened at all, since no one at all mentioned it till 2 years after the church was officially organised in 1830. Then our entire religion and its truth claims are a fraud. David Bednar, describing the priesthood authority to perform ordinances and rituals in our church as the be-all and end-all of its entire point, is also potentially setting us all up for just as big a fall. The key holders, the dungeon masters, the anointed ones, whatever you want to call them, from whose authority all our ordinances are meant to spring, are blatantly breaking the most basic rules about how they claim and pass on that power of godliness, as they see it, to each other. Elder Bednar also said to the missionaries in training, "Everything we do in this church is focused upon helping people learn about, understand, worthily receive, live, remember, and honour Jesus Christ." Oh, of course not, duh. "And honour covenants and ordinances," close quote. Whatever happened to what saves us being the love we show to the least and most difficult of our neighbours? The spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. In a follow-up post in his Facebook page, Elder Bednar wrote, quote, "At the recent Provo Missionary Training Centre devotional, I shared some of my thoughts about recognising in the scriptures what the Saviour would like for us to know and understand. For example, in the New Testament, we read the first thing the Saviour did after announcing to his apostles his impending death was to institute the sacrament. My time is at hand, Matthew 26:18. In the Book of Mormon, 3 Nephi 11, the first thing the Saviour did when he appeared to the people in the land of Bountiful was to testify of who he was and of his ministry. He also conferred priesthood authority upon his disciples and gave them instructions about the proper mode of baptism. In both of these scriptural events, when the Saviour had limited time to be with and instruct the people, he emphasized priesthood, authority, covenants, and ordinances. In our day of increasing chaos and commotion, we do not need to fear. Our Saviour emphasizes what is most important. His priesthood authority has been restored upon the earth, and through sacred ordinances we have access to the power of godliness in our lives. Priesthood ordinances, administered by the authority of God, open heavenly portals so we can have strength beyond our own. Close quote. I genuinely wonder if our apostles actually read the scriptures anymore. How on earth they could read all about the real teachings and actions of Jesus in those situations and come away with the message that the most important thing to him was that he got the ball rolling with authorized rituals to do, and that the most helpful things the world needs now is to strictly adhere to Mormon rituals and jumping through the long list of behaviours and payments that the Church expects for you to be able to access those rituals or be considered worthy enough for them to still be in effect to help and save you. Sadly, a lot of patriarchal blessings are generic duds or overtly harmful, as my wife's was in several ways. So I'm not pretending this is normal. But now as I face walking around in a totally dysfunctionally divided and unjust community, like the McGlonagans in the segregated Deep South, trying to bring some magic and joy back to people browbeaten into misery and small-mindedness, and often overwhelmed by the weight of truly awful behaviour and rhetoric from leaders and peers who should know better, I hope I will always carry the song of my patriarchal blessing and that religion in my heart wherever I go, and try to fulfill the commission it gave me to learn from wise teachers, fit together the ideas and relationships they give me, and cheerfully advance the work of the Lord by reading things which others find difficult to understand, and do what I can to explain and unravel the puzzling and daunting problems facing our church. So why all this preamble to reading you the letter I wrote to the First Presidency? Well, I've touched on some key themes. That fighting Pharisees and stepping up to be a fighter in a war of ideas that is extremely divisive and unsettling is not a violation of Christ's gospel. It is Christ's gospel. That I did not initiate any of it. That the general authorities today, this week, repeatedly declare war on vulnerable groups of people and on truth, and use militaristic metaphors as they do it. This week, Jeffrey Holland quoting and magnifying Dallin Oakes's metaphor of muskets pointed at LGBTQ people and their allies and their symbols. Muskets pointed at even the idea of a community that offers them validation, comfort, empathy, and most of all, real hope for a safe and happy life as the people God made them here and now. I've explored the current state of play regarding what the First Presidency are saying and policy making and enacting regarding their power and definitions of church doctrine and policy, which specifically led to my being put on trial for opposing them and their policies. I have recapped some of the many strategies to keep the members in such ignorance and so hyper-vigilant about dissent or fearing anything they haven't heard before, like the danger-averse paranoia of the dad in The Croods, that my talking about things that I was taught in seminary or that are in the church's own gospel topics essays published 8 years ago in 2013, that they were told in the ensign by an apostle to study until they know them like the back of their hand, is interpreted by some of my fellow ward members to be acts of apostasy so dangerous I must be excommunicated and silenced. Before the trial, I did not know that this was one of the reasons they hit the Court of Love nuclear button. I thought I was there because of the podcast and my Facebook posts, but the stake president added to the accusations he listed that I was felt to be so threatening and intimidating in what I said in lessons that they are finding it hard to call teachers because they are afraid of having to face me and my contributions in their lessons. This seems rather fishy to me because we're a tiny ward, so it's hard to find anyone to do any calling. And the teachers often ask me lots of questions in the lessons because when they are struggling to get anyone else to respond or contribute, they know I'll have something to say, and for several of the last 20 years of my life, I have been the gospel doctrine teacher. My current Elders Quorum president was my bishop for years in my previous ward, and fearless, and asked me to contribute more than anyone has. And the current gospel doctrine teacher is literally living in my house right now, so I know it's not them complaining and fearful. The Latter-day Saints who are most likely to be the uncomfortable ones are the ignorant, who have obediently done as they were told and only ever consumed the correlated curriculum, who joined the church as adults and never did seminary or institute. So it's not inaccurate to say their knowledge of the restored gospel and its history and doctrines is literally, objectively, elementary school level, church primary level. And as soon as anyone says something different to the same old repeated questions on a 4-year loop that mostly require the answers, pray, read the scriptures, keep the commandments, follow the prophet, they get very uncomfortable and panic. We have those people in most wards, but they tend to be balanced to some extent by the more informed people who have done institute and seminary and know a bit more, and a handful who have gone whole hog into their research and actually read the gospel topics essays or deeper histories of the church. But one of the main points or warnings I'm trying to give the rest of the church is that those people are the first to leave. They find out about the lies first, and they leave. They spend years trying to change the church's oppressive and shaming Pharisee culture until they burn out and leave. And when they leave, who is left? Predominantly the people with the least gospel knowledge, the least historical knowledge, the least able to think outside the box or innovate, the least curious to know more than the very basics of Mormonism's traditional narratives, the most likely to be completely brainwashed Pharisees who believe and teach the Pharisee religion, that it's all about appearances and performing on a Sunday as perfectly dressed and well-behaved passive drones, that this is the religion, its entire point. They find it comforting to hear and think and say exactly the same oversimplified things every Sunday in an otherwise confusing and disappointing and unpredictable world. It is their safety blanket, their false comforter. So when anyone speaks an uncomfortable or unfamiliar truth, it's as if someone snatches the comforter from a baby. It will shock them, and then they will cry and need comforting and soothing again till they settle down and go back to sleepwalking the church off a cliff. These are not the dynamic innovators or effective member missionaries. Like the reliable, traditional-minded flower arrangers and hymn book organisers, the Church of England made the fatal mistake of pandering to, instead of modernising and reforming to keep their young people, or being effective evangelists. They do not grow the church. They can be adorable, loyal deliverers of compassionate service, whose long years of faithful attendance and keeping the lights on is an important component of an effective LDS congregation. But on their own, when they are the only people left, they will kill it faster than an army of anti-Mormons. And given the choice, if we have to alienate a group of people and have loads of them leave the church, it would have been much more sensible in the long run to err towards alienating uninformed traditionalists and kept the dynamic thinkers and teachers and missionaries who keep our religion interesting and engaging and actually grow it. We'd have thriving congregations and an exciting future if we had. The tragedy of dying denominations is that they make this one mistake, favouring the Pharisees over the Christians, the managers over the leaders, the soothing and familiar over the innovating and new, the pious over the actually spiritual. They choose the dignified Sanhedrin over the outsider Messiah with the potty mouth and the uncouth friends. When my stake president lost his rag with me and sent me a rather snappy email saying he couldn't see any redeeming qualities in my podcast and reiterating the threat of church discipline, I was, as usual, going to go into one and wrote a long email arguing my case. But then a listener intervened and saved him another hour or two of reading by messaging to me a perfect meme that I simply sent to my state president instead, as my response to his final threat. It was a quote written by the great English author Charlotte Bronte in the preface of Jane Eyre, written in 1848, while thousands of Mormon pioneers started to trek across the plains to the Salt Lake Valley. And it absolutely, perfectly sums up the points of my Christians versus Pharisees podcast and my defense against accusations of apostasy for doing and saying what I'm doing and saying and how I do and say it. Quote, "Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last. To pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns." Close quote. Our tragedy is that, like so many other Christian churches and religions generally, too many of our leaders and members have decided that the highest state of holiness and righteousness is measured by being conventional in clothing and behaviour and thoughts and habits. In prioritising and making sacred being conventional in clothing and behaviour and thoughts and habits, they begin to be insensitive and indifferent and judgmental to the gifts and goodness of people who do not fit that lifestyle. And then, having dehumanized and othered those people, they become assertively cruel by slandering and persecuting those people as the enemy, the threat to their families and communities and civilization. They become wholly self-righteous. They conceptualize the mind and will and personality and even the physical appearance of God in their own image. Because when you insist that there is only one acceptable way to dress and behave and think, diversity of appearance and having different opinions becomes a sign of social collapse and evil and danger. Anyone different to yourself must by definition be wrong and ungodly. Whereas Christian Mormons ask first, what can I learn from this new and different person and their new and different perspectives? What do they know that I don't know yet? I will ask them and hope they will be generous enough to tell me all about it. And when people like Jesus come along and tell them they've got it all wrong, and that real religion is to break out of such stifling and homogeneous and elitist communities, and go and find and bring in all the people they rejected and alienated, the tramps and vagabonds and outcasts and misfits, because those are the ones he is inviting to his banquet, they kill him. And they've been killing or excommunicating the people repeating Jesus' message to them in Jesus' sometimes quite rabble-rousing way ever since. So if we are going to be warriors and martyrs for truth, justice and Jesus' way, let's have this as our motto, our marching song. Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last. To pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns. I have severely self-censored in my comments in Sunday lessons. Apart from a couple of strong statements about the hypocrisy of hoarding vast wealth in elders' quorum lessons, with only experienced members present, I have not said anything deeper or more controversial than the basic stuff in the Gospel Topics essays and what I was taught in seminary and institute many years ago. But because most of the people still coming to my ward now haven't ever heard those things, I'm always alarming them, it seems, by saying things that for the first half of my life would not have been regarded as controversial. And this is where all your congregations are heading if you keep driving away the informed people and are still doing nothing in your stake to make sure the older members have all read and understood the gospel topics essays, like my stake has failed so spectacularly to. So here I am, still mad as hell and not taking it anymore, committed to reforms to get our religion back to its best theology, and back to its original and scriptural constitution for carefully separating power and decision-making between all its members, rather than a dictatorship of 15 always old men. What if you could write to those old men who have ruined your religion and your family's participation in it by making it deceptive, toxic, and dysfunctional? And they actually have to read what you write. What would you say to them? What would you want them to know about you and your life and your experiences of the religion they teach? Probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that very few church members ever get. There's so much to discuss, but I did my best to keep it focused on the main things that matter most, and kept it to a short and sweet 26 pages. While I eagerly await their response, hopeful that they will actually answer the 3 questions my stake president has been unable or unwilling to answer, and realise that I and people like me are making reasonable, evidence-based points we shouldn't be excommunicated for because they are all true. If you fancy knowing what I wrote to the First Presidency, you can hear it all in episode 8b, in which I will simply read it to you. Maybe it will become a viral hit as one of those stories people listen to fall asleep and cure their insomnia. Or maybe you will have as much fun with it as I did, telling the First Presidency a few home truths about themselves. Either way, I think God's angry, there's loads of thunder. Either way, just as we know from the letters Boyd K. Packer quoted from in 1993 and Jeffrey Holland referenced in 2021, don't kid yourself that somehow they don't realise the suffering and harm they are causing with their words and actions and policies. They know all about it. Again and again, church members have written to them to tell them in excruciating detail exactly how their stubborn, dogmatic, uncompromising fanaticism is ruining people's lives and families. And they really don't care. They think they do. They cry crocodile tears, but they never take responsibility. They do not care enough to change fast enough to save the church from being destroyed on their watch. So it is going to be up to the rest of us to save it, and maybe save them from themselves. What are you prepared to do to steer the good ship Zion away from the very big, immovable icebergs it is already crashing into? How far out of your comfort zone are you willing to go if having your wards survive and your children and grandchildren raised as healthy and happy Latter-day Saints is important to you?